Yu Young-in was an ordinary office worker in the modern world. She, like everyone else, enjoyed life and rejoiced in every day. One such day, she was slowly returning home. But suddenly, she froze in place when she saw a car rushing towards her. Yu Young-in was frozen in shock and unable to move. Then she was hit by a truck and died. Then the young lady woke up. And she woke up in the novel she had been reading shortly before her death. One day, she was passionately kissing a young man. She froze and looked at Prince Albert Grey in surprise. Then the thing from the novel flashed through her mind. The young lady was shocked as she realized that she was the prince's servant. She was confused and didn't understand what was going on. She looked at the prince with confusion because she did not understand why everything turned out this way. A moment later, she was taken aback and wondered what she had just been doing with the prince while he looked at her in confusion. Prince Albert had a very handsome and delightful appearance. He knew how to fence, and his skills surpassed everyone in the world. The prince was a very famous person. All people admired him. But, unfortunately, the king envied the prince and hated him because the prince was not his own son. King Rostrat the Grey was unfortunately impotent. The king could not produce offspring, and everyone around knew about it. Because of his complex, the king chose an unremarkable child as his successor. His successor was Albert, a small and quiet boy. Due to the loss of his family, he was an orphan and had no one around him. But the king had no idea that Albert would become an outstanding ruler in the future. Because of the king's hatred and malice, Albert was arrested and imprisoned in a tower on a slanderous denunciation. Where many powerful magicians used a powerful spell in the tower, Albert was imprisoned along with his maid. The king really wanted to destroy the young prince, so he chose the maid who was obsessed with the prince. He flinched every time she touched him. Once upon a time, the king deliberately gave a young lady a magic wand. The king really wanted the young lady to rule the prince. And also, the excellent wand was the key to the entrance and exit to the tower. The maid was so strict that the prince could not even go to the kitchen without her permission. The prince's whole life was in the hands of the little maid, starting with ordinary hugs, ending with passionate and unbridled kisses. But even an ordinary maid did not stop at this. She went much further. She did everything to drive the prince to the edge. But the prince, in turn, was not so stupid. After he cleverly seduced the maid, he managed to get hold of the magic wand. Exactly a year had passed since his imprisonment, and then he tried to get out of the tower. But first of all, he dealt with his warden. Albert, without a drop of regret and with rage, struck her and killed her. She didn't make a sound as she died. She suffered the miserable death of a minor villain in the novel. So, the young lady transformed into the villain from the novel. The prince looked at her in surprise and called out. He looked at her with a smile and asked if he could kiss her again. The young lady was taken aback and, pushing him away, said that he must stop. She knew that if he showed the magic wand, she would become possessed by the prince. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if this was true. Albert came closer to her and asked if she could show him the wand. The young lady knew that she could not give it to him. She was in shock because she understood that at this rate she might die before the prince killed her. She sighed heavily because she didn't know what to do. A moment later, the prince took the wand back and thanked her with a smile, but froze when he touched it. The young lady was in shock. She understood that as soon as she succumbed to his charm, her death would come. Some time later, the young lady sat quietly at the table. She understood perfectly well that she needed to calm down and accept the situation. She knew that the novel had a sad ending, but she understood that with the right actions, the plot could be changed. She knew that this was her chance to live a different and new life. She knew that Albert was the future king. For this reason, she only had to protect her life. She knew she had to make a deal with the prince to cooperate so she could give him the wand. He looked at her intently and with a delightful smile, asked if she needed anything. She smiled and said that, of course not. He said with a grin that she must have liked the kiss, because he thought he was very good at that. The young lady froze for a moment as he blinded her with his beauty. She looked at him hard and said that he didn't want that. The young lady told the prince that if he didn't want to do it, then he didn't have to. The prince stood frozen in place for a moment in surprise. A moment later, he smiled and asked what she wanted to talk about. A moment later, the young lady placed a contract on the table and said that she was proposing to enter into a contract. He looked at her with a smile and asked if the conditions were really his body. The young lady shuddered because she did not expect to hear such a thing. She knew that, according to the plot, they slept together after that, which meant he had no intention of killing her, but she shyly shouted that he wanted to do it. He looked at her intently and, with a smile, said that she liked him. The prince looked at her intently and slowly brushed the hair from his face. The young lady knew that although she was now a servant, she was not one. Now she just wanted to get out of the tower and live a quiet life. She asked the prince to look at the contract. He was surprised, because the contract guaranteed her life. She said that everything was exactly like that, because what she wanted most of all was for him and her to get out of the tower as soon as possible. She looked closely at the prince and said that she was even ready to help him escape. In return, she asked only for a peaceful life with prosperity. She looked at the prince intently and insistently asked him to look at the entire contract. She also said that the contract stated that there would be no actions that would dishonor him. The young lady, in turn, very much hoped that he would sign the contract. He looked at her in surprise and said that he just couldn't believe that she was the same person she used to be. She said that when he kissed her, she realized she had made a mistake, and it reminded her of her destiny. He looked at her in surprise because he did not understand what she was talking about. She said that she realized that he could escape from the tower at any moment. She said that when he left the tower, he would immediately kill her. Albert looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady, with tears in her eyes, cried out that everything was right, and that instant death awaited her. He was surprised. He did not understand what had come into her head during the kiss. She looked at him with tears in her eyes, because she knew that he would certainly kill her. Albert slowly moved closer to the young lady and quietly called her. Rose froze in place with embarrassment. He smiled a gentle smile and said that he liked her from the very beginning. She looked at him intently, as she understood that he was now practicing his tricks on her to seduce her. He quietly said that she should come closer to him. Rose looked at him confusedly and asked why she should do that. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really going to kiss her. She knew that now she could gain the prince's trust. He smiled and said that it was all true, and also asked if she didn't want it. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she did not want that, but she also hesitated, not finishing her sentence. She sighed heavily and said that he wanted to kiss her because he didn't trust her, and he was now trying to test how she would behave. He smiled and said he didn't know what happened, but people can change. She said no one changes overnight, and that was hard to believe. The prince laughed and a moment later said that she was right. With lightning speed, he hugged the young lady and said with a smile that he would check everything later. He looked at her intently and said that if she didn't like it, she should tell him right away. The young lady froze in place in embarrassment as he touched her face tenderly. She was shocked and didn't understand why she would suddenly like it. A moment later, the prince kissed her with all caution and passion. She knew that she should simply not react to his kiss. After a few minutes of passionate kissing, the prince threw the young lady onto the bed. Rose was taken aback and froze, as she did not expect this. Albert, with the speed of lightning, embraced the young lady and kissed her tenderly. The lady was surprised and wondered when he would finish his kiss, but a moment later, she was taken aback as he slowly lifted her dress. He kissed her for a while longer, but he saw that there was no reaction, so he decided to leave. The prince glanced sideways at the young lady, as her behavior was different. Rose looked at the prince with surprise and embarrassment. He smiled and asked if she would show him the contract. A moment later, the young lady changed her face, and with a joyful smile said that she would now show everything. Some time later, they were sitting at the table, beginning to discuss the agreement. Alberto looked at her intently and asked how she could believe all this for him. The lady said they would simply sign the contract using magic. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she knew that he could use magic. She was taken aback because she knew that Albert's ability to use magic was kept a secret and no one knew about it. The young lady learned about this when she read the novel. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if she had jumped to conclusions. She said with a smile that the reason he asked to see the wand was because he wanted to break the spell with magic. He smiled and said he thought she didn't know about it. The young lady sighed heavily as she saw that he was quite the bore. Albert asked why she had let him see the wand then. He knew it put her at a disadvantage. She said sheepishly that she had simply succumbed to his charms and forgotten herself. He looked at her intently and said with a grin that he was amazed. He thought the whole arrangement was very interesting. The young lady looked at him with a smile, as she was very nervous. The prince said that he couldn't use magic here. She was shocked, and for this reason, he just wanted to look at the wand. She looked at her in surprise and asked if the agreement would really be made verbally then. The prince sighed heavily and said that if he trusted her, then yes. The young lady stood frozen and taken aback for a moment, but still she knew that they should be afraid. She said that she would do everything in her power. She signed the contract for their union. Because of this, she even kissed him. She asked if she had threatened him. Rose looked intently at the prince and said that they were now on equal terms. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. The young lady said that they were both in the tower. She was ready to fulfill all the conditions of the contract, and she expected the same from him. She had several conditions. She wanted to have a guarantee, after her escape, that she would survive. She wanted to be in money and burn in abundance. She also hoped that they would not, under any circumstances, touch each other without permission. She looked at the prince intently and said that she was offering him this because she believed that he would fulfill all the conditions. She sighed heavily and said that if they were not fulfilled, they would receive punishment. He asked in surprise what punishment she was talking about. She smiled and said that it would cost them their lives. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as this was a great surprise for him. Rose said in all seriousness that this would be their guarantee. He looked at her closely and said with a grin that it seemed like she was being sincere now. She smiled and said that she had always been sincere. He smiled and said that in that case she should bring a pen. The young lady said that she would do everything and ran off in a hurry. The prince looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she would regret signing the contract. She looked at him in bewilderment and asked why he thought she would regret it. He smiled and said he thought she liked his body. Rose sighed heavily and said that in the face of death, all desires disappear. A moment later, the prince signed the contract, and the young lady signed it as well. She smiled and told the prince that she would do her best to help him get out of the tower. A moment later, the young lady froze in surprise when she saw the prince bow to her in return. He looked at her tenderly and said with a smile that in that case he would also try. The next day, the young lady was slowly getting ready. She knew that because of yesterday's contract, the prince had become an important person to her. She was calm because she knew that now her life was not in danger, and she was even guaranteed a comfortable existence. But until their plan works, she needs to meet all his needs. She knew he shouldn't underestimate the office worker who went through blueberries to the stars, and she knew the plot. However, she missed one important point. She and the prince are roommates. The young lady slowly walked down and greeted the prince, but a moment later, she was taken aback and froze in place with embarrassment. The prince smiled and also greeted her, and also informed her that he had just gotten out of the shower and finished his sword training. The young lady turned away from the prince in a hurry and froze in embarrassment. She asked if he would really walk like that. A moment later, the prince dressed and asked her if she was happy with the way she looked. Rose looked at him intently and said that it was much better this way, and now he should only walk like this. Albert asked if I really needed this. Rose said that it was exactly like that. She was in shock. She didn't understand why he was so stubborn. She was in shock because she realized that she would have to live in the same room with her man. She knew that no matter how smart the prince was, it would take time to remove the spell from the tower. She understood that until that time, they would burn together, and she needed to meet with him as little as possible. Unfortunately, she did not know his character, habits, and lifestyle. She looked at him intently, as she knew that she had a chance to find out everything. Rose wanted to find common interests and a common language. She said that they needed to discuss something. The young lady looked at the prince intently and said that she must know all his preferences. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He was shocked and didn't understand why she was saying such provocative things, but she managed to get ahead of him and asked what food he liked. He looked at her in surprise, and she asked in response what provocative things they were talking about. A moment later, the young lady laughed and asked what he was thinking, since that was not what she had meant at all. Rose said that as long as they lived together, she was the only one who knew how to cook for them. She smiled and said that it would be better to state his food preferences now. He thought for a moment and said that he didn't have any particular favorite dishes, so she could cook whatever she liked. The young lady, in turn, beamed at his words. She sighed heavily and said with a joyful smile that in that case she would solve everything. She was happy because she knew she could cook him Korean food. The reason she chose this particular kitchen was because she was currently in a novel. She was surprised that they were cooking Korean food in a Western country. She was shocked because she knew it was just not mental. But she still decided to implement it, because all the fault was on the main character, since she herself was from Korea. The heroine, in turn, wanted to prepare a native song, and she had all the ingredients for preparing Korean food. Then she happily invited everyone to her place, and everyone liked her food. At that moment, the prince accidentally heard people praising the young lady's food. At that time, Korean cuisine spread. Albert was very interested and decided to try the delicious dishes. The young lady was a little puzzled, because she wanted to read further and find out how they continued their communication. She knew very well that the main character was a Korean chef, and from this, she knew that the prince liked this cuisine. She sighed heavily, because she knew that now was not the time for this. Opening the door, she saw the knight. He looked at her intently, without a drop of hospitality, and asked if something was wrong. She looked intently at the knight and with an innocent, joyful smile, said that today was Monday and even earlier in the morning. Rose gave the king a report once a week on how she had bullied the prince. She knew she had to give such reports in order for him to trust her. She gave the document to the guard because it stated what she needed. She was glad that the real maid had already written the report, because she was worried that she might have written something wrong. She was furious because she knew she had to try, otherwise the king would simply execute her. Some time later, she looked intently at the king's face as he brought them provisions. He sighed heavily and said that he had brought everything she asked for, and also asked if she needed anything else. A moment later, she handed him the letter and told him that he should bring everything she had written. He asked in surprise if she really needed everything on the list. She said that she would torture the prince, and he would starve until his stomach would stick to his back, and she would feed him spicy food, because that was her evil plan. She looked at the knight intently and said that he also had something to convey to the king. She looked at the knight with a grin and said that her prince would be a frightened mouse. The prince said with a smile, "Young lady," that she had tried very well. He smiled and asked if she was really going to torture him. The young lady was shocked, and she shouted that it was not so, and she did it to gain their trust. She knew perfectly well that she had to get the ingredients, but she had to come up with something to do it before the king became suspicious of her. And she simply had no other choice, because she was a villain. She sighed heavily, because she knew that after reading so many novels, she never thought that she would have to play this role herself. The young lady said that she had obtained all the ingredients and would soon prepare the best dish. He said that he was looking forward to it, but was afraid of getting poisoned. The prince sighed heavily and, smiling, said that she could kill him. The young lady was shocked. She shouted to the prince that this was not so. A moment later, the young lady was also looking intently at the prince and his delightful and radiant smile. He looked at her closely and said that, whatever the case, she had really changed. Because before she was only interested in his body, but she still cooked deliciously. He looked at her intently and said that she was indeed a different person. The young lady was taken aback and said that this was nonsense. With tears in her eyes, she said that when they kissed, she realized how stupid she had been before. She looked at him intently and asked if that was why he signed the contract. He said she would know when she completed it. The prince looked at her closely and said that there must have been a reason why she had changed so drastically. She knew he still doubted her, but it didn't matter, because she really was a different person now. She understood that it would take some time for him to get used to her. She said that she had something she wanted to tell him. She looked at him intently and said that it might surprise him, but he shouldn't fall in love with her. She understood that he was only in a fantasy novel, and there was a pattern to everything, because if the contents were reversed, the main character will definitely fall in love with her. She knew that this was a typical love story. She looked at the prince intently, because she didn't want to fall in love with anyone right now. She understood perfectly well that the handsome prince who was now next to her could, in the end, kill her with his ease. She knew that when he was little, he was almost poisoned. He was born into a count's family, and although he was of blue blood, he did not live like a nobleman. He was taken aback when he saw that someone had poisoned him. The young people screamed and begged him not to die. But still they looked at him with a haughty grin, as if they were curious as to who could have done this. She knew that he had somehow managed to recover, but they were just trying to take his place, and in the end, they all killed each other for power. After the Count's family self-destructed, Albert hoped that his life would finally change, but ended up locked in a tower with a crazy maid, and he no longer had trust in people. She wondered if he was capable of loving someone now. She knew that it definitely wouldn't be her. The young lady sighed heavily as she realized that their lives were very similar. She lost her parents when she just finished her studies due to an accident. She had no time to grieve for her parents. No matter how hard it was for her, she did not give up and tried to live on. She didn't know how she adapted to her new life so quickly, but she knew that she didn't need love at all. The young lady understood that they would only ruin each other this way. Rose smiled and asked him not to fall in love with her. A moment later, the prince could not resist laughing loudly. He looked at her with fury and told her that she didn't need to worry, because he didn't understand how he could have fallen in love with her in the first place. The young lady was astonished at what she heard. She said that, of course, it sounded absurd. She sighed heavily and said that no one knew what might happen, and after all, there were only the two of them here, and for this reason, she just wanted to play it safe. He looked at her sharply and said coldly that she didn't need to worry about it and they could stop talking about it. He looked at her intently and said that he would never fall in love with her. Rose said with a joyful smile that she was very glad to hear such words. She smiled and said that she hoped he wouldn't change his mind. She asked him not to forget what he had said. Albert looked at her closely and said with a smile that she looked great. The young lady laughed nervously and asked if that was true. She smiled and said it was because she could finally go outside. He asked if she really wanted to get out of here as soon as possible. She really wanted this because she could go for a walk, talk to different people, eat something tasty, meet the man of her dreams. She was very sorry that she did not have the internet and a mobile phone. She smiled and asked when the prince was leaving. He looked at her in bewilderment for a moment, and then said that going outside was no problem. He sighed heavily and said that the wand that closed the doors was broken. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect such a thing. She looked at him in surprise and asked if there was really nothing more to magic. She said that the prince turned out to be a genius. She smiled and asked when they could go outside. He looked at her intently and said that it would take at least 3 more months. The young lady froze in place in shock. She didn't understand why everything turned out this way. The prince said that if she left now, the king would immediately notice. She knew that Albert had managed to escape from the Baltic Sea a year later. Before that, he had been busy with self-development. Good luck to you with your mind and your physical strength. He looked closely at the young owners and said that he thought of this tower as his opportunity to change everything, so he was in no hurry. He sighed heavily and said that she should be patient for a little while. And he, of course, knew that she wanted to leave. But he needed time. She smiled and said that she would endure everything, and he did not need to worry about her. She said that she would patiently wait for the moment, and he could do everything as he saw fit for now. He looked at her intently as she walked away, but said nothing. A whole week passed because of her imprisonment. The king did not doubt her and sent the ingredients. The young lady, in turn, was glad, because she knew that she could at least eat well. Initially, when she didn't understand anything, it was very difficult to cook. She understood that the world she found herself in was crazy, but she thanked the author for not being too clever with the plot. She knew it was time to relieve all the stress, so she wanted to cook a Korean recipe. Sometime later, the young lady prepared an excellent dish. She admired the pleasant, familiar smell. A moment later, she was taken aback because she had forgotten one ingredient. She looked closely at the dish, as she knew that a soft-boiled egg on top of a delicious dish was perfect. But still, she wondered if the prince would eat it. Sometime later, the young lady presented the prince with delicious treats, but he looked at the dish with distrust. Albert sighed heavily and asked what she wanted to feed him. She smiled and said that spicy food was one of her favorites. She smiled and said that today's dish would be very different from the others. He said that today she was acting surprisingly confident. Albert said that she used to feed him only porridge. She ran away and said that it was all because she was a bad cook. She smiled and said that today everything was different, because it was her favorite food. The prince said that for the first time in his life he saw red food. He looked at her intently and asked if she would like to try the dish first. The young lady, with her joyful smile, said that she would be happy to try it, because it had been a long time since she had eaten food that reminded her of her homeland. A moment later, she blushed as the food was very hot. The prince looked at her with surprise and bewilderment. Rose shouted with a satisfied smile that she had done it. She said that the food was really delicious. She looked at the prince intently and said that this was the best way to relieve stress. He looked at her in bewilderment. She smiled and said that where she lived, this was how they relieved stress. That is, they ate spicy food. Lost in her memories, the young lady said with a smile that she was very glad that she had made delicious tteokbokki. She looked at him intently and said that he should trust her and try, since he hadn't even had breakfast. A moment later, the prince took a bite. Rose looked at him intently and asked if he liked the dish. She said that she prepared it according to her own recipe. The prince called the young lady. She ran away and asked if he didn't like it. The prince looked at the young lady with a gentle smile and said that the taste was very delicate. The young lady, in turn, looked at the prince with admiration, as she wanted to protect him. A moment later, she hit her head on the table with a crash. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and asked if she was okay. With lightning speed, the young lady sat up and said that, of course, she was perfectly fine. She smiled and said that she was very glad that the prince liked her dish. She smiled, and looking at the prince, said that if he liked something, she noticed how he involuntarily began to smile. The prince froze in shock and surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. He looked away from her, embarrassed, and said that it was simply very tasty. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he wanted more. Albert smiled and said he didn't mind. She smiled and said he blushed. He said he just felt stuffy and she shouldn't jump to conclusions. A moment later, the young lady smiled and said that everything was fine, and also asked if he wanted an egg. She was enjoying this creation. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that it seemed very easy to make her happy. She smiled and said that when it tastes good and brings pleasure, that is happiness. Looking at the prince, she asked if he didn't feel the same now. She smiled and asked if he would resist the feeling of happiness. He liked the dish. Albert said that he doesn't know what happiness is, but he just feels good now. He noted that it was very pleasant to eat with someone. The young lady looked at the prince with embarrassment, in a way that pleased her too. She smiled and said that sharing a meal with him was also a joy for her. Late at night, the young lady was sleeping quietly in her room, but something was bothering her, so she tossed and turned. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she did not understand why her stomach hurt. She wondered if it was all because of the spicy food. At the same time, the prince sat quietly in his room and read a book. But a moment later, he made a bend because he heard some noise. Albert came out of the room and, looking at the young lady, asked what she was doing. The young lady was taken aback and shuddered when she heard his voice. She looked at the prince with bewilderment and asked if she had woken him up. He asked in surprise what was wrong with her face. Rose looked at him puzzled and asked what was wrong with her face. A moment later, she fell to the ground. The prince ran to her with lightning speed. He said that her face was very pale. He saw that she was covered in cold. Then he wanted to know where and what hurt her. She screamed that her stomach hurt, and it was all because of the food. He sighed heavily and said that now he understood her, and now he could help. He asked where her wand was. The young lady showed him where it was. A moment later, she froze in shock as she realized her wand was missing. He said she should look again, as it couldn't have just disappeared. She sighed heavily and said that it seemed like the stick had fallen. Rose. Looking at the princesses, she said that she had one way. He asked in surprise if she really wanted to use treatment with a needle. A moment later, the young lady pricked herself, but the prince quickly pulled her hand away and shouted at her dangerously. The young lady sighed heavily, but did not answer him. She sighed heavily and said that in the world where she lived, this was how they treated diseases, after which the pain went away. She noticed that she had black blood. The young lady froze for a moment as she heard laughter. The prince looked at her intently and said that she was right, and it was a very good treatment. She was shocked and screamed at him not to laugh. Albert said that he had learned something new and also asked if her stomach was hurting. She said that she felt better and also asked if he could lend her a handkerchief. He looked at her intently and said that he would help her himself. A moment later, he pulled her finger towards him and began to help her get rid of the blood. The young lady froze for a moment in embarrassment, as she did not expect to see such a thing. He looked at her intently and said with a predatory smile that where he lived, that was exactly how blood was cleaned up. The next morning, the young lady was very tired as she was unable to sleep. She was puzzled because it was all because of the prince. She wondered if he was deliberately, constantly wasting his charm on everyone around him. She sighed heavily because she understood that she would have to live in the same house with the prince. A moment later, she hid herself, wanting to get rid of her thoughts as quickly as possible. The young lady was puzzled. She didn't understand what she was even thinking. She thought the prince was flirting with her. But I was shocked and didn't understand where she was getting such messages from, because she already had a lot of problems. Rose wondered what if the prince really liked her. A moment later, she sighed heavily, knowing that this simply couldn't be true. She knew she had to get out of the tower and start a new life. The next day, the young lady made no attempt to get closer to the prince. She tried to avoid his gaze. A few days later, the prince came down and asked how she was feeling. She avoided him in every possible way, citing the fact that she was very busy. The prince looked at her in bewilderment, as he saw that she had changed in her behavior. Albert looked at her closely and said that it looked like she hadn't eaten today. She smiled and said that she was on a diet. A few days later, she walked around him and said that she was constantly busy. The prince tried in every way to talk to her, but she ran away, citing work. She tried very hard to avoid the prince as much as possible. He looked at her in surprise and said that it looked like she hadn't eaten again today. He looked at her intently and said he could hear her hungry stomach. And unfortunately, after some time, the young lady found herself in a very dangerous situation. He said that if she continued to eat little, she would get sick again. He looked at her closely and with a smirk asked if she really enjoyed it when he treated her. The young lady screamed that she didn't. She sighed heavily, because she knew that she needed to quickly find an excuse and leave, but she didn't know what to say. Albert looked closely at the new dishes and noticed that she had prepared some strange dish again. She knew perfectly well that it would be better if she had no contact with him at all, but in turn, she was taken aback and wondered if it would be better for her to communicate with him more now. She looked closely at the prince and said with a smile that they could get a pet, because they were already bored living together. Rose looked at the prince with a pleading look. Albert looked at her puzzledly and agreed. The young lady, in turn, blossomed before our eyes. She was glad that he agreed. The next day, the knight told the young lady that they had brought her some food. She froze in place when she saw the little beauty. He said that the outfits she ordered were already ready. Rose looked at the knight in surprise and asked what was next to him. The knight informed the young lady that there was a cat in front of her, but she had recently been weaned and needed to be fed more often. The young lady looked at the animal in bewilderment. The knight said that in front of her was a black cat, which was able to get into the tower. He said that cats are evil spirits. The young lady was shocked, as she understood that many powerful magicians had put protection on the tower, and he simply entered. The knight told the young lady that if she didn't like the cat, she could return it and they would bring another pet. The young lady glanced sideways at her new pet. As he was without a mother, she froze for a moment and remembered her past life, because she also lost her mother. A moment later, she said with a radiant smile that she would take the cat with her. Some time later, the young lady was breathing heavily, as this time she had to fiddle with the groceries. She glanced sideways at her little pet. She understood that no matter how she looked at him, he didn't look like a cat at all. She saw that he was white and had a small horn, and he also had wings and a small tail, and he stood on two legs. It seemed to her that he looked like a dragon. He looked at her intently and asked if she meant him. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place. She froze in shock when she saw that he could talk to her. Some time later, the young lady burst into the prince's room with the speed of lightning and called him. He asked her in surprise what she wanted, without looking up from his book. She looked at him intently and said that he should take a look at the new pet. The prince looked at him in surprise. She said that the soldiers had carried a giant cat. The prince froze, looking at the cute creature. The young lady looked at the prince intently and shouted that she now had white creatures in her arms. But what was more important was that the creature spoke like a man. He sighed heavily and said that it was a dragon. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing, but he said that she was holding a dragon. She was shocked and wondered if there really were such creatures in the novel. She was very worried that the plot might be different. She froze in surprise and shock because she realized something. She was glad because she understood that she could get out of the tower. She could kill the king and fly far away on the dragon. She froze for a moment as she realized that this was a very tempting idea. She knew that this was her chance. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked what had happened. She smiled and said that the animal was very cute because it had horns and wings. Albert said that normal cats don't look like that, and she believed the soldiers. He noted that there were usually a few types of people who could see the true face of a dragon. The dragon's guardians could see his true face. He also said that the mages could see the dragons from the crowd, but he knew that she had nothing to do with either the guardians or the mages. The young lady, in turn, froze in surprise, because she did not understand what was happening at all and how she could see the dragon. He looked at her closely and asked if she saw the dragon, and also remarked that it was very strange. She thought that it was probably just the effect of the tower. The prince sighed heavily and said that it might be so. He knew very well that the magic tower was permeated with magical power. The young lady was surprised, because now she understood that dragons existed. The prince said that this was not at all something to admire, because in front of her was only a baby dragon. She asked in surprise if it was bad to raise a dragon. Albert sighed heavily and said that a dragon and a baby dragon are different animals. A dragon that has become an adult is a truly powerful beast. Such a beast could cause natural disasters by creating powerful magical energy. It could overcome time and space. But the cubs could do none of this, and it was shameful to even call them dragons, because they could be easily killed. The prince slowly stroked the animal and said that he had hidden himself as a cat to protect himself. The prince said that when he turned 500 years old, he would have to awaken. She realized that he would become a terrible and powerful beast in the future. The prince said that most dragons cannot overcome the trials. Unfortunately, most of them died. The lady was shocked by these facts. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if that was why they invented legends about dragons, because they also die. She sighed heavily, but did not answer his question. With tears in her eyes, she said that she would find a way and the dragon would survive. She looked at him intently and asked why he was so sure that he, the little dragon, would die. A moment later, the prince told her that it was not that at all. He began to tell her all about dragons. His explanations were terrible. In order for a dragon to become an adult, it must survive alone. Unfortunately, most dragons die before they survive the hardships, and adult dragons are a rare sight in the world. She knew that if she became his guardian, shared his pain, and he would have a better chance of surviving. The prince said that an experienced poppy would not look at a baby dragon. Rose didn't understand why adult dragons didn't help their children. He couldn't answer the question and thought that they had more important things to worry about. Albert said she could give him a lot of love before he died. She said she needed time to think it over. The young lady looked at her pet in surprise and asked with a smile if he was hungry. She decided, sighed, because she understood that the prince was right. Because if you take responsibility for someone, then life must be done in such a way that he does not suffer. She knew perfectly well that even if she became a ghost, she would take care of the little dragon. A moment later, she prepared the dish. The dragon was amazed by the beauty of the dish. She smiled and said she made him French toast. A moment later, the cute dragon was enjoying a delicious toast. She looked at him closely and thought with a smile that he looked like a dog. She wondered how old he was. She looked closely at the cute dragon and asked how old he was. He smiled and said that he would soon be 500 years old. Rose was shocked by what she heard, because she understood that he only had a year left before the end of his life. The young lady was taken aback, as she understood that the baby was close to his death. Rose understood perfectly well that if she left him now, no one would help him. She understood perfectly well that the dragon was not at all lucky with her, but she wondered how she could find a professional magician. The dragon looked at her intently, and with a radiant smile asked if something was bothering her. Rose asked with a smile how he had lived all this time. Enjoying a snack, the dragon said that he had been sleeping. The dragon smiled and said that he was a small dragon, and so he went into the cave and slept there all this time. The young lady was in shock. She realized that he was all alone in a cold and damp cave. She did not understand how he survived in such a place. She was puzzled, because she knew how much time he had left, and she didn't want him to die like that. She knew she had to find a way to help him survive, because she had no reason to live anyway. She knew that her parents were also dead, and there was a time when she thought that there was no point in living alone either. But her friends and colleagues made her live, and then she was truly happy with them, even though it was all fleeting. But she knew that small joys still supported her. She looked at the dragon intently, as she realized that she simply couldn't let him die so early. She knew she had to find a way, and she had to save him. The young lady looked closely at the little dragon. She smiled and asked his name. He said he had no name. The young lady was furious, because she realized that he didn't even have a name. A moment later, the announcer looked at him with a radiant smile and said that from now on, he would have a new name, and his name would be Hyon. She smiled and said that his name meant white snow. Rose asked, with a smile, if he liked the name. She looked at the dragon intently and said that they could live together. He looked at her in surprise and asked what that meant. Rose smiled and said that they would live together, under one roof as a family. She wanted to find a reason to live on. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that she had one problem left. She was puzzled, because she did not know how to tell the prince about it. She quietly spied on the prince, as she saw that he was preoccupied with something. She slowly approached him and asked if he was feeling unwell. Albert sighed heavily and said that it was not that simple. Everything was so complicated. He thought that he would finish for today. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was doing, because last time he said it would take several months. Albert looked at her intently and said that he needed more time, because he was going to catch the right moment. Rose looked closely at the prince, because she understood that he had some kind of plan. She knew that he really was a genius. She saw a beautiful and thoughtful face. She sighed heavily and said that he had something on his face. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she saw there. The young lady said with a joyful smile that he had a beautiful face. The prince was taken aback and froze in place in surprise. She sighed heavily and said that it was a joke, but he really was handsome. A moment later, she noticed that the prince laughed. Rose looked closely at the prince as she saw his radiant smile. Looking at him, her soul became warmer and calmer. She smiled and asked if they would be getting out of the tower soon. She said she was very excited. Albert said she was, but he also asked what she was going to do when she got out of the tower. But she sighed heavily and said that she was going to a decent city and would live there as a landowner. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect such a thing. She smiled and said that she would like to live in a small town, not far from the capital, with good infrastructure. She would like to buy a large plot of land and rent it out to people, and she would live in a small house for one person so that she would not have problems with money. She smiled her radiant smile and said that she wanted to travel too and sail on a cruise ship. She smiled and said that she would like to eat at a famous restaurant and order all sorts of delicious things, because she really loved sweets. A moment later, her eyes lit up, and she said she could just hire a good pastry chef and have a pastry festival. He looked at her closely and said that the life she wanted was quite ordinary. She smiled and said that it was just like that, because she liked simple things and, frankly, living a normal life is not as simple as it seemed at first glance. He looked at her in surprise and asked what her difficulty was. She smiled, looking at the prince, and said that he would not understand, since he had always lived in luxury. Rose said she wanted to enjoy a simple and normal life. She looked at the prince intently and asked what he would do. He sighed heavily and said that he would most likely become king. He said that he had to become king in order to live on. The young lady looked away from the prince as she thought about what was said for a moment and realized that they had completely different plans for the future. She understood that the prince was still the main character, and she was in supporting roles. She understood that, of course, they could not have a common future. She sighed heavily and said that the life of a prince must indeed be full, and it was completely different from her life. Albert sighed heavily and with an innocent smile said that everything was correct, and if they left the tower, their paths would diverge. She looked closely at the prince and said that she was glad that she was not in his place, and he would never encounter a maid like her. Albert looked at the young lady with confusion and said that everything was correct. Rose looked at the prince intently and said that she had decided something. Albert looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand what she was talking about. The young lady said that she had decided to keep the dragon. He looked at her in bewilderment and asked what this had to do with him. Rose told the prince that he would be busy when he returned to the imperial palace, so she didn't want to burden him at all. But she still wanted to stay with Hyan. Principal looked at her in surprise, asked what she was talking about. He looked at her with fury and asked who she wanted to stay with. The young lady was taken aback by his intense gaze. She sighed heavily and said that she had recently given the dragon a name. The prince was surprised, because he knew that not even a day had passed, and he had already become attached to her. Rose sighed and said that the time they spent together was the best. He looked at the young lady closely and said that knowing her, he could be sure that she would not abandon the dragon to its fate. But still, he said that later, she would greatly regret not letting him go now. She sighed heavily and said sadly that, however, she did not regret meeting the dragon, and she knew very well that time was passing. He looked at her intently and asked what she would do during his awakening. Albert asked what she would do when he left her. He sighed heavily and said that the dragon would most likely not survive, and it was stupid to start a relationship because everything was already predetermined. The young lady, in turn, firmly said that this was not so, and this was only the beginning of their relationship, and it would be stupid to give up right away, because she knew that happier memories would remain. She looked at the prince intently and firmly said that until the time came, she would not abandon the dear dragon. Rose sighed heavily and said that the dragon had come to them, and this was a chance for everyone. The young lady, in turn, looked warily at the prince, wondering if she had offended him. She looked at him intently, for she saw that he was deep in thought. She was very afraid that he might cut her throat for her insolence. She was in shock, because she realized that she was not immortal at all. A moment later, the prince said she could do whatever she wanted. Rose froze in shock. He looked at her intently and said with a sweet smile that it seemed she had managed to convince him. He slowly rose from his chair and said that he would not disturb her. She looked at him in surprise and asked if his stubbornness had really left him so quickly. Albert looked at her in surprise and asked if, in her opinion, he was the stubborn one. The young lady cried out that it was not so. The prince said that he merely assumed that she would do something like that. Rose timidly asked if he was not even surprised. He looked at her intently and said that if he said he wasn't surprised, it would be a lie. A moment later, the prince walked slowly up to her and straightened her hair. He looked at her intently and said that she should cut his hair in the evening, because the back of his head was very overgrown. The young lady was taken aback by this and looked at him embarrassedly, because she had never cut her hair before. She remembered that during dinner, they had promised each other not to enter the rooms. He smiled and said that everything was fine. All she had to do was cut his hair according to his instructions. The young lady was taken aback, but still agreed. She was in shock, because she realized that she was falling in love with his beauty. Rose sighed heavily, feeling so swollen that it was hopeless, but wondered if she should even agree to such a thing. As she was leaving, she turned around because the prince called her. But, unfortunately, the young lady tripped on the steps and began to fall. A moment later, she was taken aback, as she did not understand why she was not in pain. Opening her eyes, she was dumbfounded, as she saw the prince, who was asking her to be careful. A moment later, the prince pulled her closer to him. The lady froze for a moment. She was shocked, because she realized that the prince had a very pleasant aroma. He whispered softly in her ear and asked if she was okay. Rose froze for a moment in embarrassment. He looked at her closely and told her that she should go down more carefully. The young lady recoiled and pushed the prince away, and also thanked him for being able to catch her. A moment later, she was leaving in a hurry, knowing she had to prepare dinner. Sometime later, the young lady was preparing dinner in the kitchen, but still the prince did not leave her thoughts. She was in shock, because she did not understand what had happened recently. She was very confused, because she could not calm down. The dragon looked at her intently and said that she was all on fire. Rose looked at him in bewilderment as she did not expect to hear such a thing from him. A moment later, she said with a smile that it was not so, and she was not hot at all. He smiled and asked if it was not great. Rose looked at him with bewilderment and also said that she would now cook him a delicious meal. She was puzzled because she knew that if she had a mobile phone, she would have captured everything on camera. He looked at her intently and asked what she was cooking. She smiled and said that she made fried chicken. Rose looked at the dragon and asked if he wanted to try it. Hyon smiled and said that he wanted to eat everything. Rose looked at him intently and, pushing the chicken towards his face, told him to be careful because it was hot. A moment later, she set it down and looked at the cute dragon with a smile as he enjoyed his meal. He was amazed because he felt a very familiar taste. The young lady, in turn, wondered if dragons ate chicken. She looked at him with a smile and said that he should leave some for the prince. The young lady, in turn, walked slowly towards the prince. She knew that this food was created for the gods, and the prince would like it too. A moment later, she froze at the door as she heard the prince talking to someone. The prince looked at his wand with anger, as he had failed, and knew he had to try again. The wand told him that the mercenaries had set fire to the place where the king was staying. All the people who were there had died. Everyone thought that it was not an accident, but it was clear that it was an attempt on the king's life. The prince was informed that they were all looking for evidence of the attack. The young lady, in turn, froze for a moment at the door. The prince looked at her in surprise, asked when she had arrived. Rose laughed hysterically and said that she had just arrived. He came closer to her to stroke her head as he saw that she had brought him food. The young lady slowly took his hand from her head and said that it was all right, because she saw that he was working. He looked at her closely and said that he thought she was sick. He sighed heavily and said that he didn't think it would take longer than he planned. He looked closely at the young lady and asked if she was surprised. She sighed heavily and said that it was exactly so. Albert, that he had no idea that the wand might not work. The young lady sighed heavily and cursed. Albert laughed and said that it was the first time he had heard her swear. Rose looked at the prince intently and asked if he wasn't upset that it was a waste of time. He sighed heavily and said that it was. A moment later, Albert's expression changed, and he said that anger and sadness would not help him in any way. He needed to think about how to increase his strength and carefully plan his revenge. He wanted to kill the current king and become the new one. She looked at him intently and said that just thinking like that and doing nothing was useless. She looked at the prince with fury and said that if he could not do anything, then she could think of something because she could do something. The prince was shocked as she swore at the king quite a bit. A moment later, the prince laughed and asked where she learned to swear like that. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was just very angry right now. She smiled and told him that the chicken was already cold and asked if he wanted to have dinner. He looked at her intently and said that this food was no longer red. She smiled and said that today's dish took a long time to prepare because it was also unusual. Rose smiled and pushed a plate of chicken towards the prince, telling him that it was the tastiest part of the chicken. He looked at her in surprise and asked if the leg was really the tastiest part. The young lady said with a smile that this was exactly how it was done, and traditionally, when chicken was served, it meant that the one for whom it was being cooked was highly valued. She smiled and said that it meant that she liked him. She smiled and said that he should know that she was constantly thinking about him. For this reason, he should definitely try the chicken and say whether he liked the dish or not. He looked at her with a beaming smile and said that she shouldn't exaggerate so much. Rose said that she was telling the truth. She looked at him intently and said that he should start eating quickly, otherwise the dish would get cold. The prince was a little surprised and asked how to eat this dish. She smiled and said that he should just pick up the leg and eat it. Albert looked at the young lady in bewilderment and asked why he had to eat it with his hands. She smiled and said that he could, of course, eat it with a fork, but it was not very convenient. He looked at her closely and said that there were many outstanding chefs in the world, but there was no one like her. Albert sighed heavily and said that it was very strange, because no one had eaten with him or cooked such unusual food for him. The young lady thought for a moment, for she knew that the prince and his companion would soon meet, but she wondered if he would fall in love with her. As far as she understood, The plot here was a little different. She knew that the heroine was very wise and beautiful. Unlike her, she was not suitable for the prince. She understood that in this the plot coincided. She thought that it was very strange that such a prince could fall in love with her. Albert looked at her intently and asked what she was thinking about. The young lady was taken aback and threw all her thoughts away. She smiled and said that she wondered if the prince was in love with anyone. Albert looked at her in bewilderment and asked why she suddenly thought about it. She looked at him intently and said with a smile that he didn't have to answer if he didn't want to. Albert sighed heavily and said that it was so. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was true. Albert smiled tenderly and said that it was when he was young, he met a girl so pure and innocent. The young lady sighed heavily. She was shocked by what she heard. He looked at her intently and said that he had answered her question. Rose looked at him in surprise and asked if that was all. A moment later, the prince was enjoying the delicious dish. Rose looked at the prince because he immediately smiled, returned, and asked if he felt better after the delicious food. She smiled and said that she hoped that the food he was eating would somehow comfort him in such a difficult moment. Albert looked at her intently, but did not answer. She smiled, a gentle smile, and said that just because he hadn't told her didn't mean he was okay. Albert sighed heavily and thanked her with a gentle smile. Rose looked closely at the prince, as she was glad that he was feeling better. He was unfairly imprisoned in the tower, so she understood the prince's situation very well. The prince looked intently at the magic wand that was shining on the table. He slowly approached her and, taking her in his hands, noticed a bright glow. A moment later, the young man told the prince that he knew very well that he was upset about what had happened, but he had information that he wanted to tell the prince. The prince sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, and there was no need to worry about what happened, because they needed to focus on work. The young man said that first he would report on the state of the magic tower. He made a list of all the magicians involved in the imprisonment and would soon check them. He also said that half of the magicians were wanted, and he also told the prince that he would soon come out. The prince froze for a moment in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such a thing. The prince sighed heavily and told his friend that if he said that, then he was in big trouble. He smiled a gentle smile and said that he understood everything. The young man told the prince that he always said everything was fine, but he shouldn't hide anything because they would soon get him out of the tower, and as soon as he got out, they could get rid of the maid right away. The young man said he would do everything. The prince froze for a moment and was taken aback. He did not expect this. The young man looked at the prince in surprise and called him out, as he was alarmed by his reaction. The prince smiled and told his friend that he knew he was worried about him, but he didn't need to worry about his maid anymore. The prince thought for a moment and said that the maid was just an innocent child. He smiled a gentle smile and said that she was different from the one he knew before. Liam looked at the prince in surprise, as he did not expect to hear anything like that at all. The prince said that they would simply leave. The young man sighed heavily and told the prince that he understood him, and therefore they should end the conversation. The prince sighed heavily because he knew that this was all very strange, because when he first found himself in this tower and met her, he thought of killing her right then and there. He saw her lustful look and saw her absurd actions, but the current Rose seems to have become a different person. He was surprised and did not understand why she had changed so suddenly. Life in the tower had changed her. He didn't know if it was a lie or reality. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly in her room and wrote a list. She wrote about her pet's preferences. She thought that his body was similar to a human's. In order to become stronger, he needed to increase his endurance. She knew that he needed to train for this. The young lady, in turn, understood perfectly well that everything she could do was a basic exercise. She knew that each exercise would be good for increasing her endurance. She thought for a moment, because she knew that right now she could benefit from various videos from social networks. She knew perfectly well that she could see a couple of useful exercises. But unfortunately, she realized that she needed to come up with something, and quickly. Rose knew that she could ask the prince for this information. A moment later, she plopped down on the bed, knowing she could ask him about it tomorrow morning. She understood perfectly well that the training would not be easy. The next morning, the young lady barely woke up and sleepily went downstairs. She heard the prince's voice and sleepily greeted him. Rose was taken aback and screamed in embarrassment. Albert looked at her in bewilderment, as he did not understand her reaction. Albert looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing at such an early hour. The young lady, in turn, looked at him embarrassedly and began to say something timidly. A moment later, she came to her senses and said in all seriousness that she wanted to force Hyan to train. He looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect to hear something like that. Rose smiled and said that everything was exactly like that, and this was her first step in caring for the dragon. She really wanted to increase his endurance. The young lady sighed heavily and said that, however, she was very terrible at sports and would like to ask the prince for advice. He sighed heavily and said that she was really heartless. He sighed heavily and thinking, said that as a maid, she decided to leave the dragon and come to the prince for advice. The young lady sighed heavily, for everything was true and she could not object to his words. She looked at the prince intently and wondered how she could get him to help her. Albert looked at her intently and said that in that case she should listen to him. Rose was very happy because he decided to help her. He looked at her intently and informed her that she would be training with him. The young lady in turn backed away, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. Rose looked at him timidly and asked if she really had to do this too. He smiled and said that if she agreed, he could help her with her training. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she was not good at sports. He sighed heavily and said that she should just answer yes or no. A moment later, the young lady's expression changed, and with lightning speed, she shouted that she agreed and that she loved playing sports. Albert looked at her intently and said that they should train every morning except for weekends. And he also asked with a sly grin, how about training together? The young lady, in turn, with tears in her eyes, shouted that she liked everything and that everything suited her, and she also wanted them to start training as soon as possible. He looked at her intently and said that they could start from today. Rose was taken aback and asked him to start from tomorrow. Leaving with lightning speed, she informed him that they should not skip breakfast. She smiled and asked him to get ready for tomorrow's training, and she also casually said that she loved him. The prince froze in place in surprise, because he did not expect this. A moment later, the young lady was already in the kitchen, sighing heavily as she almost fell into the clutches of the prince. She thought for a moment and looked away in embarrassment, as she remembered that she had told the prince that she loved him. She really hoped that he simply didn't hear her words. She was also very worried that he might perceive her words in a different light. Sometime later, the day of the prince's haircut came. She thought about doing his hair, so she tried to practice so as not to ruin everything. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked with a smile if he had finished with the paperwork. Albert sighed heavily and said that he had already finished everything and was ready. A moment later, she sighed heavily and, gathering her strength, said that they might as well start now. The young lady very much hoped that she would succeed. She looked closely at the prince, because she saw that his bangs had really grown out. She thought that they were really bothering him. The young lady slowly moved closer to the prince and asked if she could cut his bangs. He looked at her in surprise and asked how long she wanted it to be. A moment later, the young lady looked away from him in embarrassment and said she would like it done just below her eyebrows. He took her hand gently and said it would be good if she pointed to him right at her hair. The young lady stood frozen in place for a moment in embarrassment. He smiled and said that, in that case, he could understand her and make an appropriate decision. Rose, in turn, was flushed with embarrassment. She knew that she needed to calm down. After all, it was a simple haircut. She hoped that Albert did not hear the beating of her heart. A moment later, her lady showed him how much she wanted to remove. He smiled and said that everything suited him. She was glad, for she saw that he had not noticed anything. Her young lady said with a smile that in that case she could proceed with the haircut, and he should close his eyes. A moment later, the young lady slowly began her work. After a few minutes, she breathed a sigh of relief and informed the prince that she had done everything. She sighed heavily, as she thought she would die from the strain. She smiled and called out to the prince shyly. She wondered if she had done something wrong, as she saw his reaction. The prince, with the speed of lightning, took the young lady by the hand and pulled her closer to him. She was very embarrassed and did not know what to do. A moment later, the prince stood up and looked at her intently, with a radiant smile. He came even closer to her and quietly whispered in her ear that he would like to kiss her. Rose froze in place in surprise and embarrassment. He looked into her eyes and said that he would like to kiss her right now. The young lady was in shock. She kept telling herself that she couldn't do it. She was puzzled and didn't understand why she couldn't just push the prince away. A moment later, the prince tenderly kissed the young lady. After a few minutes of passionate kissing, he looked at her intently and said with a smile that it was very good. Rose, in turn, looked at the prince because she was sure that he saw her only as a simple maid. But she really liked him. She was in shock because she did not understand what she had just thought about. The young lady understood perfectly well that she and the prince could not be together. Rose looked at the prince and said in all seriousness that they needed to talk. He looked at her in surprise and asked if something had happened. The young lady was silent for a moment, but after a few minutes, she asked shyly if he really liked her. The prince, in turn, looked at her intently but did not answer. A moment later, his face changed, and with a gentle smile, he said that then she must answer his question. He smiled and asked what she thought of him. The young lady froze in place in surprise, as she did not expect such a question. She looked at him intently and said that she was in love with the prince. He accepted her confession with a joyful smile. But a moment later, she said that it was not love at all. The prince was taken aback, as he did not expect such a thing. He looked at her intently and said that in that case, he would like to ask her one more question. He was interested in why she kissed him back. She was embarrassed, looked away from him, and timidly said that he was too handsome to refuse. The prince sighed heavily and looked at her with a smile. She said that now he must answer her question. The prince looked at her with a smile and said that he would certainly answer. He sighed heavily and said that he cared about her, but unfortunately, he didn't know why. Rose was a little surprised by this answer. She didn't understand why he cared about her. She wondered if he really liked her. She knew that she was a worthy maid who tried to take possession of him by force. She looked at him intently and said that he himself said that he would not fall in love with her. The prince sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. A moment later, he said that it was very strange, because it was as if she had become a completely different person. She looked at him in surprise, because she did not expect this. He slowly approached her and said in all seriousness that he was a man who was not used to unrequited love. He looked at her with a smirk and said that he would make her love him. The young lady was shocked because she realized that he really liked her. She looked at him closely and said that the wand was making itself felt. Albert said that he heard it and also asked her if she heard his confession. The young lady sighed heavily as she understood that the prince would no longer pretend. This time, the Baron contacted the principal and reported that the Duke had been attacked by a magician and reported that the Duke was not in the best condition at the moment. He said, "I will bring it," that he should come and personally see everything for himself. Albert looked intently at the young lady and, asking for forgiveness, said that he had to go out urgently. She looked at him in surprise and did not ask how she could get out if there were soldiers outside. Albert said that they had no intention of going through the door, as they could simply walk through the air. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she could trust him. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. A moment later, she called out to him in surprise and said that they were now on the 3rd floor. A moment later, the prince took the wand and used magic. The young lady was shocked because she saw that there was not even a ceiling in the room. Albert looked at her intently and said that she should take his hand. She was taken aback, but still agreed. A moment later, with the speed of lightning, they were transported to the roof. The young lady was amazed by the sight. She wondered if everything that had just happened was real. She was shocked and at the same time delighted by the beautiful sky. She saw that the sky was very clear. Rose sighed heavily as she had not breathed fresh air for a very long time. She looked at him intently and asked if he wasn't happy being outside the tower. Albert sighed heavily and said that, honestly, he didn't feel much of a change. Albert looked at her intently and said that they needed to hurry, because after they got out, they needed to teleport, because the Duke lived in the north. Rose looked at him, asked if he was stupid or just handsome, in principle, lived, sighed, and said that he was very popular among young ladies. The prince looked at the young lady with a grin and said that if she was interested, it would be better for her to find out about everything personally. And he also said that she should not talk about other men with him. The young lady laughed timidly and said that in any case, she would like to teleport away as soon as possible. A moment later, the prince used magic and cast a protection on them. Rose screamed as she began to rise into the air. Rose looked at the prince intently and asked with a happy smile if she also cast the spell. Would she be able to use magic? Because she saw that he cast the spell in English, and she knew it very well. Albert looked at her with a smile and said that the spell was just the last nuance in magic, and if he could use magic by simply speaking words, anyone could become an archmage. She smiled and said that she was just joking. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was dark now, so he should light the way for them. Moments later, he cast the spell and felt sick. The young lady worriedly asked the prince if he was sick. He sighed heavily and said that he was not, and they should concentrate on the spell. She looked at him closely because she could see that he didn't look very well. She knew she had to ask him about it later. A moment later, they were transported into a dense forest. Albert glanced sideways at his companion and said that the core of this magic was the magic circle. Albert asked the young lady how well she knew magic and whether she could draw such a circle, because he understood perfectly well that it was all about her skills and knowledge. She looked at him intently with a smile on her face, because she understood that he decided to explain everything to her. After a few minutes, he turned around and, looking intently at the young lady, said that they needed to hurry. Rose, for her part, was a little confused, wondering if they should hold hands while teleporting. At the same time, the dragon, yawning, said that this was a very useful magical power. The young lady, in turn, felt that she was slowly falling asleep. Some time later, they were transported to the northern duchy. She knew that by the date it should be spring now, but she saw that there was a lot of snow around. A moment later, the knights and the baron ran out to them. They were all alarmed. For a few seconds, they all greeted the prince politely. The prince looked closely at everyone present and said that they had not seen each other for a long time, and he also asked how things were going. A moment later, they began to report to him the situation in the duchy. The young lady sighed heavily as she saw that no one showed the slightest interest in her, and it seemed to her that she was superfluous. A moment later, the young man looked at the prince intently and said that he must put on the cloak. The prince glanced sideways at the young lady, who was shivering with cold. He slowly walked closer to her and threw a cape over her shoulders. He said that it was very cold here, and also asked what would happen if her lips turned blue. She froze in indignation and coldness on the spot. Everyone present was shocked by the prince's actions, because they did not expect anything like this from him. The prince quietly approached the young lady and whispered softly in her ear, and said that if she needed anything, she could just tell him about it. The prince looked at everyone present and said that Roger Artis was in front of them now. He lives here, and he is also his faithful ally. The young man looked at the maid with anger and intently, for he knew that she was the maid who had been sent by the king to the prince. He quickly apologized to the young lady and said that he was distracted by the prince and did not notice her. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was nothing to worry about. Rose was surprised, as the nobleman apologized to a simple maid. Albert walked slowly into the castle and said that they needed to discuss everything. Some time later, the lady entered the room sighing heavily. Rose knew that Albert went to the Duke, and Hyan immediately went to bed. Rose sighed heavily, because she didn't know what to do now. A moment later, she jumped as she saw someone enter the room. Rose was surprised, because she saw the Baron in front of her. The Baron looked at the young lady with fury, and said that he did not know what kind of magic she used, but it would not work on him, shouting and demanding an antidote from her. He looked at her intently and said angrily that she would do better to give it up the easy way. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment and said that she did not understand at all what he was talking about. The Baron looked at her with cold fury and said that she understood everything perfectly well. She was in shock. She did not understand how she could know such a thing if it was he who came quite suddenly and began to demand something from her. She understood perfectly well that she needed to calmly endure everything. She remembered how she had previously worked with clients. She smiled and said that she did not understand at all what kind of antidote they were talking about and what he needed at all. Rose looked at him in surprise and asked why he was asking her for something like that. The Baron looked at her with a grin and said that the prince's behavior today was completely different from usual. He looked closely at the young lady and said that he had never seen anything like it, and it was all because she had used some kind of potion on the prince. The young lady was shocked because she told him that she had done nothing of the sort. She thought for a moment as she realized that the prince's behavior was very strange, and now it seemed to her that he really was under the influence of some kind of spell. She sighed heavily and said that she had not given the prince anything or mixed anything in. The young man looked at her with fury and said that it was simply impossible. She looked at him intently and said that if she had such powers, she would use them on him. He looked at her with cold fury and asked if she would use her powers on him. With lightning speed, he grabbed his sword. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock when the sword was at her throat. She was taken aback and trembling with fear, said that if all this were true, events would have developed differently. Trembling with fear, she said that she had only pleased the prince because of her efforts. The Baron looked at her in bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. She looked closely at the young man because she understood that he also really wanted to please Albert. She understood that this was her chance. Rose looked at him intently and asked with a smile if he didn't want to know how she managed to win the prince's heart. With lightning speed, the young man put his sword back in its sheath and asked her how she liked it. Rose said, with a happy and satisfied smile, that it turned out that she was a pretty good cook. Rose sighed because she understood that, frankly speaking, she didn't know how to cook anything other than spicy food. A moment later, the young man's expression changed, and he asked in surprise if there was no other way. She smiled and said that she praised his appearance and ability every day. He sighed heavily and said that he did so. The Baron knew that it was natural for a prince to receive compliments on his appearance and skills. He looked at her intently and said angrily that there was nothing special about her doing this. The young lady sighed heavily and looked into the distance with a smile, as she understood that he respected the prince madly. She smiled at her intently, looked at him, and also informed him that she had only told the truth so far. The young lady looked at the defense with a radiant smile, thus blinding him with her beauty. He sighed heavily and said that in that case, he would personally ask the prince's wedding about it. The young lady smiled and said defensively that he should be careful. Some time later, the young girl and her glaciers were sleeping in bed, hugging a cute dragon. The prince looked at her intently, and with a smile said that it was time for them to go back. She sighed heavily and wrapped herself up warmly, saying that she was cold. A moment later, the prince sat down next to the young lady and muttered something quietly. A few seconds later, he touched her face and thus woke her up. The young lady, half asleep, did not understand who was touching her. Opening her eyes, she clearly saw the prince in front of her, who was smiling tenderly at her. He looked at her intently and asked with a smile if she had slept well. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected to see him at all. She looked at him intently, and, embarrassed, she said that he was breaking the contract they had recently made. He smiled and said that he had already received her permission. The young lady, embarrassed, said that she did not remember such a thing. A moment later, she got ahead of him, remembering that he had asked her a few minutes ago if she could let him touch her the way he wanted. She sighed heavily, for she knew that the prince was not at all repulsive to her, but still she did not understand what had come over him and why he behaved this way. Rose froze in place for a moment as the prince approached her. A moment later, the young dragon said that he was having trouble breathing. Young Lydia was taken aback and asked her pet for forgiveness. He smiled and said that he was fine. She looked closely at her beloved dragon because she asked him to save her from the seduced prince. The dragon glanced sideways at the prince, but he gave him an angry, cold look. Hyan, in turn, only snorted and moved on. He sighed heavily and, looking at the young people, said that they should decide their own affairs, and a moment later he went to the door. He said that he was afraid of the prince. The prince looked after him with a satisfied smile and said that he would consider it a compliment. A moment later, the young lady said that she had given him permission to do such things. He looked at her in bewilderment, not understanding what she was talking about. Rose cried out in embarrassment that she was canceling this decision. The prince looked at the young lady with a satisfied smile. He sighed heavily, and as he left, said that, although he was sad, If she did not want it, he could not do anything about it. The young lady was truly surprised by his obedience. It seemed to her that the prince had such a piercing gaze that he could simply ignore her words. The prince said that she should hurry up and prepare for her return. She was surprised and at the same time puzzled, because she did not understand why his behavior suddenly changed. She wondered if this was another plan to kill her. She was sure that if the Baron saw this scene, he would immediately suspect her and try to kill her. Albert looked at the young lady intently and called her. She was taken aback and cried out, as she was deeply immersed in her thoughts. He asked in surprise if she was really sad to leave this place. Rose said with a smile that she was a little sad to leave, because there were beautiful and large rooms here. But in the tower, everything was completely different. Alberto smiled and said that they should go back now, and then they would find out if it was possible to somehow change the interior of the tower. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if this was true. In her joy, she almost confessed her love to the prince again, but she promised and froze in place. A moment later, she thanked him with an embarrassed smile. She was puzzled because she realized that she had almost blurted out again that she loved him. He looked at her in surprise and with a sly grin asked why she changed her sentence. Albert smiled and said that she could continue what she wanted to say. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place from shock. He looked at her closely and said with a smirk that he knew she was saying such things without thinking. He walked closer to her and said with a smile that, for this reason, she could just say it without thinking about anything. The young lady froze in place for a moment. She sighed heavily and said that she could not express it in words, and now she would rather show him everything. She shyly shouted that she was showing him the heart, which means love. He looked at her in surprise and asked her if this action with her hands really meant love. A moment later, she showed him another action and said with a smile that it was very similar. He smiled and said that he didn't know about that at all. She sighed heavily and looked away from him, knowing that she had managed to avoid the topic. A moment later, there was a knock at the door, and the young men were informed that the Duke had arrived. The prince sighed heavily, having previously told him that he should rest. The young lady froze for a moment, as she could now see the Duke with her own eyes. She was very interested in what he really looked like, because she thought he was incredibly handsome. The prince looked closely at the young lady, as he saw the change in her face. He sighed heavily and said that it seemed to bother her. She smiled and said that she only wanted to observe etiquette. He thought closer to her and said that he did not think that this was the only reason. She smiled and said that it was not so. She was sure that all the characters would be beautiful. After a few minutes, Albert sighed heavily and told the Duke that he could come in. The young lady, in turn, changed her face with lightning speed. A few minutes later, the Duke entered the room and greeted the prince. The young lady froze in shock in one place, as she saw that he was truly the Northern Duke. The Duke glanced sideways at the young lady and said that she must be that devoted person. The young lady's face changed with lightning speed. She was amazed. Albert said with a smile that everything was exactly like that. The Duke looked closely at the young lady and said that she must take care of the prince. She sighed heavily and said that she would definitely do everything for this. She was surprised, because she thought that he would ignore or show hostility towards her, but everything was different. The Duke looked at the prince closely and said that he must be feeling unwell because he had used up so much magic power. He did not understand why the prince was in such a hurry. Neglecting this, the Baron told the prince that he should rest a little. Albert looked at the Duke and said that he had also recovered, so there was no need to stay here any longer, and in the tower he had tried his powers. But they were not stable. He did not know for sure at what point they could be revealed, so it would be better for them to return back. The Duke said that he understood him. The Duke was agitated and puzzled, because he was very sorry that everything happened because of his carelessness. Albert sighed heavily and said that there was nothing wrong with it, and he also asked if he had brought what they had talked about earlier. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he had brought everything. The young lady looked at them in bewilderment, as she did not understand what kind of bag he was handing to the prince. A moment later, the prince smiled and handed the young lady a small bag. Rose was amazed, because she did not understand what it was. Albert smiled and told the young lady that he was giving her a chance to take anything she liked with her. He said it was a magic bag that expanded inside, and she could put in and take out any item. Albert looked at her intently, and with a beaming smile said that she could take whatever she wanted. Rose looked at him in surprise and asked if she could really take anything. He smiled and said that it was true. A moment later, the young lady said that he himself had given her permission to do so, and the prince smiled and said that she could do as she wished. With the speed of lightning, the young lady's expression changed, and with a satisfied smile said that she would do everything now. A moment later, the young lady sighed heavily, as she was tired from the long meetings. After a few minutes, everyone was looking at her intently, as she had collected everything she wanted. Rose looked at the prince with a happy smile and said that she had diligently carried out his order. Everyone present was shocked. Her actions did not make the prince respond. A moment later, the prince looked at her with a joyful smile and said that she was very kind. The duke and baron looked at the prince and his companion in bewilderment. The young lady sighed heavily and looked at the small bag in surprise. She didn't understand if they would be able to take all of this with them. Albert smiled and said that she should trust in magic. A moment later, the young lady noticed that the bag had become very light. He looked at her intently and with a soft smile, holding out his hand to her, said that it was time for them to go. The young lady was taken aback, as he acted very unexpectedly. With lightning speed, she handed it to him in a bag. Albert froze in bewilderment, looking at the bag, because he thought that she would take his hand. But with lightning speed, she looked at her dragon and called him to her. Albert looked at the young lady with a grin and said that it looked like his method would be needed now too. Rose sighed, knowing she couldn't win. Sometime later, with the help of magic, they were transported to the tower. She looked closely at the dragon and said with a smile that he could now go to bed. She turned around and, smiling, looking at the prince, said that it would be better for him to rest too. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place from the slag when she saw that the prince had become ill. He sighed heavily and said, puzzled, that he was fine and she could go and rest. Rose looked at the prince intently and said that she did not think so. She wanted to know since when he had such a state. Now she understood why he wanted to quickly return to the tower. He sighed heavily and said that she now saw not his best appearance. The young lady was puzzled and worried, because she had been with him for a very long time, but did not know about his illness. She understood perfectly well that it was entirely her fault. Hyan slowly approached the young lady and asked anxiously what had happened. She sighed heavily and said that the prince was ill. The young dragon looked closely at the young lady and asked if in that case the prince would die. Rose screamed and said that he would not die. He sighed heavily and said with sadness in his voice that if they get sick, they die. She looked closely at the dragon, as she knew that most dragons do not survive the trials. Rose told the cute little dragon in all seriousness that he will not die. She said, showing him that even if he feels bad, he will call. The young lady slowly approached the prince and asked if he could rise. Albert sighed heavily and said with an innocent smile that she didn't respect him at all. Moments later, the prince tried to lift himself up and stand up. After some time, he finally managed to do it, and as he left, he said that she should go with him. Rose looked intently at the prince, but said nothing. She sighed heavily and wondered how he had lived until now. Some time later, the prince was lying quietly in his bed. Rose came closer to him and said that she had brought him some water to wash with. She looked at him, worried, and asked if she could help him. She was taken aback, wondering if he could have misunderstood her. She cried out that her intentions were completely selfless. He looked at her with a smile and asked why she was making excuses, because he understood that even a fool could see that she had simply come to look after him. The young lady looked at the prince with embarrassment, because she understood that he was right, and she was not at all obliged to explain herself to him now. He smiled and said that she could do whatever she wanted. She smiled and thanked him. The young lady looked at the prince intently and asked why he hid it. Albert sighed heavily and asked what she was talking about. Rose said he was feeling unwell even when they left the tower, and he kept overworking himself. She didn't understand why he did that. The young lady said they could have taken medicine if he said he wasn't feeling well. He looked at her intently and sighed heavily, saying that he couldn't do that. She looked at him in surprise, as she didn't understand what he was talking about. She sighed heavily and said that he was not the one who could do this, given his status, the expectations and burden placed upon him. It was not permissible for him, and it was best to be sick alone. She looked at him in surprise and asked him angrily if he should really endure it for such a reason. She understood that he felt bad when they left the tower. He sighed heavily and said that everything was just like that, and the further they moved away, the worse it was. He knew that usually it happened unnoticed, but it seemed like he had relaxed a lot to tell her something like that so easily. The young lady looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that it was not surprising. She looked at him intently and said that she did not consider his condition burdensome. She said that if he was ill, then he must be ill. The prince froze in surprise on the spot. A moment later, he said with a smile that he would do as she said. She looked at the prince intently, as she was not used to seeing him sick. She knew that he was weak in the morning because he had fallen victim to magic. The young lady was in shock, wondering what she was even thinking in front of a sick man. A moment later, she told him that she would bring him some water and also asked if he needed anything else. He said that he would like to change his clothes. She smiled and said that she would be right back. A moment later, the young lady brought him some water and new clothes. She was taken aback when she saw that the prince had become even worse. Rose looked at him worriedly and asked if he was okay. He sighed heavily and said that he was fine and would feel better in a few days. The young lady was shocked because she did not expect that he would be sick for so long. He sighed heavily and said that retribution had attacked him. Albert looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that it was he and that he had gotten off easy. A moment later, she handed him the clothes. The prince of the troops, in turn, looked at her intently and said that she should help him change his clothes. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. He sighed heavily and said in a shaky voice that it seemed that it would be difficult for him to change his clothes himself. She was shocked and wondered if he really called it easy payback. Albert looked at her intently and said that she should first unbutton all the buttons. The young lady obediently agreed with him. A moment later, she obediently began to unbutton his shirt. He smiled and quietly asked if she was nervous. The young lady was taken aback and moved away from him. He smiled and said that he thought she wouldn't be nervous. He looked at her closely and said with a smile that, ever since he first came here, she had enjoyed contact with him. Albert sighed heavily and said that now she seemed to have become a different person. The young lady was taken aback as she realized that she had fallen into a trap, and she said, embarrassed, that she could say the same about him, because he seemed completely different to her. A moment later, the young lady slowly changed his clothes. Albert looked at her with a smile and said that if you think about it, it is so. Albert looked at her intently and thanked her for her concern, saying that she could go now. She said that she would not go anywhere because he was sick, so she should be next to him. As she left, the young lady said she would bring him more wet towels. Albert froze for a moment and quoted her words from earlier. He knew that from the moment she seemed to become a different person, he himself had changed. The young lady walked slowly into the room and asked what he had just said. He turned away from her gaze and said that he had not said anything. Rose looked at him in bewilderment, but said nothing. He imagined, looked at her, and asked if she was tired. Rose sighed heavily and said that everything was fine and so he could rest. He smiled and said that he would do as she said. Albert looked at the young lady intently and, closing his eyes, said that everything would be all right if he would put aside for a while the thoughts that were giving him a severe headache. The prince fell asleep while the young lady was watching him, but before she knew it, she too had fallen asleep next to the sick prince. A moment later, she was taken aback, because she knew that she shouldn't sleep. She knew that if she moved a little, the sleep would go away. Rose understood perfectly well that to do this, she needed to unpack the things she had taken with her. After a while, she took a small bag and began to smooth out the things. She knew that while the prince was sleeping, she could put away all the things. Sometime later, she looked at all the things with a heavy sigh, as she had finished on the whole. She thought with a smile that, when the prince woke up, he would be surprised at the change. She thought for a moment, since this was the first time she had seen him sleeping. She saw that he was very handsome, even when he slept. A moment later, she was taken aback and wondered what she had been thinking about, as she had completely forgotten about the sick man. Sometime later, she realized that she needed to make breakfast. The dragon looked at her with a smile and asked what she was doing. She smiled and said that she wanted to make porridge. He looked at her in surprise and asked what it was. She said with a smile that it was some kind of soup for the sick. The cute dragon stared at the young lady who was preparing breakfast. She sighed heavily as she realized that it would take a long time for the rice to boil, which was why she wanted to make an egg roll. A moment after cooking, the young lady decided to try the dish she had prepared. She savored the beautiful dish with admiration. The dragon froze in shock on the spot. She looked at him in surprise. He looked at her intently and said that she should feed him too. A moment later, the young lady fed the dragon. He was pleased and said that it was very tasty. She smiled and asked if it was true, because the dish was very light and appetizing. He smiled and said that the red dish was also very tasty. She smiled and asked if he was talking about the fried pork with vegetables in a spicy sauce. Rose looked at the dragon intently and said with a smile that she would prepare many more wonderful dishes later. He sighed heavily and said that every day meant nothing to him. The young lady froze for a moment and stared at the dragon. She saw that her wonderful food gave the little dragon a sense of purpose in life. She smiled and said that if he wanted to eat something, he should tell her right away, and she would do everything. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he was not dying yet. Some time later, the young lady slowly returned to the prince. She knew that more time had passed than she thought. She wondered if he was still asleep or not. She slowly walked up to him and quietly called him, and also said that she had brought breakfast and asked if he could eat. He sighed heavily and said that everything was fine, but he didn't want to move. She understood perfectly well that even though he wouldn't lift a finger during his illness, he couldn't skip meals. She looked at him intently and asked shyly if she should feed him personally. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted to do. The young lady shyly shouted that she would feed him, because he needed to eat at least a little. A moment later, the prince beamed with happiness, and rising up on the bed, smiling, said that he agreed. After a few minutes, the young lady began feeding. She was glad when she saw that he ate everything. She looked at him intently and asked him with a smile how he liked the dish. He sighed heavily and said that it was the most boring food she had ever cooked. Rose smiled and said that when he got better, she would make a lot of spicy dishes, because that suited her better. The prince looked at her with a gentle smile, but said nothing. She sighed heavily and said that when they got out of here, there would be no other person who would know his tastes better. His face changed and he said that she was saying strange things. He looked at her intently and said that if there was time to talk such nonsense, she should feed him. The young lady was taken aback and agreed with him. A moment later, she said that he could rest. He sighed heavily and asked if she shouldn't sleep, since he saw that she hadn't lain down for a minute. Rose said with a radiant smile that she was not tired at all and that he could go to bed first. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that he understood her. But a moment later, he grabbed the young lady by the hand and pulled her towards him. She froze in place, embarrassed and surprised. He smiled, holding her hand, and said that he would fall asleep quickly, and until then, she should be next to him. Rose was in shock. She didn't understand what kind of situation this was. The next day, the young lady kept her eyes fixed on Sir Prince, for she saw that he looked better already. She wondered if she could get some rest too. Moments later, she spread a blanket on the ground and slowly lay down on the ground. She knew she shouldn't fall asleep, but she didn't know what she could do. She wrote slowly various thoughts about the dragon and gradually fell asleep. Rose was puzzled because she knew that she should not sleep, but she still couldn't stand it, and sighing heavily, lay down on the improvised bed. She knew that if she slept a little, nothing terrible would happen. Late in the evening, the prince woke up with a headache. He wondered if it was already night. He slowly rose from the bed. He had the feeling that the tower had changed somehow. He sighed heavily because in the morning, due to his pain, he did not even notice the changes. He looked closely at the young lady who was sleeping quietly because he knew that all the changes were due to her. He smiled tenderly as he looked at the young lady, as he realized that she must be very tired. A moment later, he looked at the list next to her in surprise. Albert slowly lifted the sheet and began to read it. He was surprised because she had written a list of what she wanted to do when she got out of the tower. He sighed heavily because he knew that he wouldn't be able to live in the tower all his life. He understood perfectly well that although his words sounded very selfish, he really enjoyed living in the tower with her. He knew that at first, any of her actions caused trembling and disgust. It was only after signing the contract that he gradually got used to everything new. She finally got inside him and won his heart. He understood perfectly well that he felt good not in the tower itself, but next to it. But, unfortunately, he knew that he was not in its future. He sighed heavily as he saw very sad things. Albert looked intently at the young lady who was sleeping quietly and with a smile asked for permission to touch her. A moment later, he took her in his arms. He hoped that, even when they got out of the tower, she would not move away from him too much. He slowly laid her on the bed and said with a smile that when he left the tower, he would certainly find her. In turn, the young lady slept quietly in bed. She was taken aback and, opening her eyes, wondered what time it was. She noticed that the sun was blinding her eyes, and the floor was very soft. A moment later, she screamed and called out to the prince. She was shocked and wondered if she had pushed the prince out and laid down on his bed. At the same time, the prince was sitting near the bed. He smiled and asked if she was awake, and also said that it was he who carried her to the bed. The young lady froze in surprise and could not utter a word. A moment later, she was taken aback and, with the speed of lightning, left the warm bed, and also asked the prince when he got up. She was shocked, because she knew that he was the one who was sick, so she did not understand why he suddenly put her on a warm bed. Albert said that it was all because she looked very tired. She sighed heavily, because she knew that whatever the case, he shouldn't have done that. He smiled and asked if she had decorated the room. The young lady asked with a smile if he had noticed. Albert smiled and said that he really liked the new decorations. She smiled and said she felt relieved. She was puzzled because she knew he had not eaten anything since breakfast. The young lady said she would quickly prepare new dishes now. But a moment later, she was taken aback as she suddenly felt dizzy. She froze for a moment in surprise and wondered if his headache had passed on to her. She pushed her thoughts away, because she knew that it had not, since he did not have a cold. He looked at her closely and asked if she was okay. Rose said with a smile that she was okay, and she just felt a little dizzy. With a joyful smile, she looked at the prince and said that she would quickly do everything and come. As she walked down the steps, she was very puzzled by her condition, because she did not understand what it was, since she knew that she had slept enough. She sighed heavily and wondered if she was simply overworked. Hyan looked at the young lady with concern and asked what happened. He looked at her closely and said that her face was different from usual. Rose smiled and said that she was fine. Just a slight headache. It bothered her, and when she rested, everything would get better. She knew that this pain was bearable, because when she went to work, it was the same. She knew that now she had to do what she did before. A moment later, the young lady handed the dragon a portion of his fried potatoes and vegetables. He sighed heavily and thanked her. The young lady called out with a smile, "I'll bring it, that his food is ready." Han looked at the young lady with sadness on his face, and since he saw that she did not have a simple headache. A moment later, the young lady, with a joyful smile, wished the prince bon appetit. He looked at her closely and asked her excitedly if she was really okay. Rose said that she was fine and felt as fresh as a cucumber. She knew that she still had the habit of enduring pain. She did not want to cause unnecessary trouble to the prince. She knew that everything would pass for her if she thought about recovery. The prince sighed heavily and called the young lady. Unfortunately, when the prince got better, she fell ill. Albert looked closely at the young lady, as he could see that she was in great pain. He sighed heavily, and looking at her, said that she did not have a fever. He understood that her illness was not transmitted from him, but he was puzzled and did not understand why she had suddenly become ill. She sighed heavily and said that she didn't think she had caught it from him, but she didn't understand what the problem was then. She was in shock and with tears in her eyes, saying that she was shivering very badly. Albert looked at him closely and said that it was very strange, because he had cast a spell so that the tower's magic would not affect her. She smiled and said that he was feeling better after all, and that was very good. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she really thought this was an appropriate topic. She smiled and asked if she could rest a little. Albert sighed heavily and said that of course she could do it. He looked at her intently and asked if he looked like the kind of person who would force a sick person to work. Rose looked closely at the prince, as she had previously thought that he was exactly that kind of person. He slowly rose up and, stroking her head, said that she should rest. The young lady looked at the prince with bewilderment, but did not answer. She was in shock and wondered how he had endured all the torment. The young lady was puzzled, and because she was in great pain, it was as if someone had hit her on the head. She sighed heavily and pushed all her thoughts away, as she knew she needed to think positively. She smiled because she knew she had accomplished one goal on her list of lying around and doing nothing. Late at night, she opened her eyes and was a little alarmed, as she did not know what time it was, but she thought her head ached less. A moment later, she started and looked around the room intently for the prince, hoping he hadn't heard anything. She sighed heavily as she realized that he had not heard anything. She was surprised, as she had never thought that she would be hungry in such a situation. A moment later, she slowly rose and sat on the bed, because she knew that she had prepared a lot of porridge and could eat it. The prince saw that she was getting ready to go somewhere and asked what she was doing now. She smiled and said that they needed to have dinner. He said that he was fine, and so she had better rest some more. The young lady looked away from the prince in embarrassment and said that she was hungry, so she would like to go and get something to eat. Albert said that in that case he would take her there. She smiled and thanked him. Albert looked closely at the young lady and said that she could lean on him more comfortably. She froze in place in embarrassment, as she saw that his hands were very warm. She wondered if it was all because she was sick. Rose smiled and said that she was a servant that the prince was taking care of. She asked with a smile what others would think if they found out about this. The prince looked at her intently and said that she could go, and that he would wait for her upstairs. He said that if he could go into the kitchen, she wouldn't have to get up. The young lady, with her radiant smile, said that she would be right back, and that he should not worry. Heian looked at the young lady closely. He sighed heavily and said that she shouldn't get sick. She smiled and said that she would not die from this, and also asked with a smile if he had seen how sick people recover. Heian moved closer to the young lady and said that she should get better soon. She smiled and took him into her arms tenderly. A moment later, she hugged him and said that she would definitely get better soon. With a smile, she said that she would quickly get back on her feet and cook him a lot of delicious things. The young lady was taken aback, as her head suddenly began to spin again. Some time later, the young lady ate a very hearty meal. She knew that it was important to eat well when you were sick. Albert looked closely at the young lady and said with a smile that she looked much better now. She smiled and said that it was so, because she knew that the pain was still bearable. He smiled and said that in that case she could go and rest. Rose happily agreed with him and also said that she would just clean up and go and rest. But a moment later, she froze in place, as her head suddenly began to spin again. She staggered. The prince looked at her with alarm and called out to her because he saw that she was not in very good condition. With the speed of lightning, the young lady sat down on the ground. She was puzzled and did not understand what was happening to her. Albert looked at her with concern and asked what was wrong. He was very worried and wanted to know if she was really ill. The young lady, breathing heavily, told the prince that he could go and rest. He looked at her in surprise and asked what nonsense she was talking about. A moment later, he came closer to her and hugged her so that she would not fall. After some time, he laid her on the bed. He was worried and did not know how he could relax in such a situation. She sighed heavily and said in a trembling voice that watching a sick person when there was nothing to help could become sad. The prince froze for a moment in surprise, as he did not expect to hear such words. He smiled and moved closer to her and asked where it hurt. She sighed heavily and said that the back of her head hurt the most, as if someone was poking her with a needle. A moment later, the prince felt the back of her head and froze for a moment. Since the symptoms were very strange, Rose was surprised and did not understand why he said such a thing. Albert looked at her intently and said that it was as if someone had used black magic. He looked at the young lady slowly and, sighing heavily, said that this was very strange. She was surprised and did not understand why he suddenly became so cold. It seemed to her that he was afraid of her. She sighed heavily because, looking at the prince, she could not at all understand what was on his mind. The lady slowly rose and sat on the bed. She sighed heavily and said that she thought he suspected her of something. The prince sighed heavily, but did not answer her. He slowly moved closer to her, and with a soft smile asked where she got this insight from. He slowly moved Rose closer to him and said that she should sit in this position for a while. She was shocked that he had done this to her without even getting her consent. He sighed heavily and said that he had nothing in mind at all. He just needed to check something. The young lady, taken aback, looked intently at the prince and asked if he knew that she was afraid. Albert sighed heavily and said that she needed to freeze and not kick. A moment later, the prince used magic on the young lady, and her pain slowly subsided. She enjoyed every breath of fresh air as it became easier for her to breathe. She wondered if it was his power. He sighed heavily and quietly asked if she had heard anything about black magic. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected such a question at all. She immediately thought of evil spells. But when she came to this world, she was immediately locked in a tower, so she could not be sure of anything. She looked at the prince intently and said that she had not heard anything about it. He smiled and said that was exactly what he thought. Rose said with a smile that he asked about it anyway. Moments later, the young lady was taken aback, as she was suddenly overcome with intense pain. She screamed involuntarily and said that she was in great pain. Albert sighed heavily and told the young lady that black magic feeds on her life force every day, but it also corrupts the soul. He looked at her intently and said that she was ill with it. The young lady was taken aback and froze in place. She was shocked, wondering what kind of life the real Rose had led. It was very strange to her that the king chose her among all the people. She was puzzled and wondered what the reason for all this was. She wondered if this illness was not accidental. The prince said that probably, while she was in the tower, the black magic did not manifest itself on her in any way. The young lady was puzzled and did not understand why everything was like this. The prince said that the sorcerers set up a barrier inside the tower so that the spell could not be used. And this time, if we talk about the changes after they went out together, they became active. She looked at the prince intently as he told her more about black magic, what it was, and why they hadn't felt it all this time. To sum it up, she could only survive if she was inside the tower. Black magicians were shortening their own lives, but they were using more powerful force than they had. She was puzzled because she didn't understand why she got sick. She knew that when the barrier that initially trapped Albert was created, it also blocked the black magic that she had become ill with. But once she left the tower, she became more active. According to Albert, her being here will stop the headache, but it doesn't change the fact that she is losing her vitality. The disease was much worse than they thought, and it was also confusing because the events were different from the original. She was originally supposed to die at the hands of the prince, and even in the canon, the story about her turned out to be as simple as possible. She wondered if the young lady in the book could also have such symptoms, but it was not told because the character was secondary. She wondered if it was because she had taken over her body. She was worried that something might have changed. The young lady sighed heavily because she knew that it didn't matter, because she didn't want to die at all. She looked at the prince intently and asked what they should do. With lightning speed, the prince tenderly embraced the young lady. She froze in surprise and embarrassment. He smiled tenderly and said that she needed his treatment, and to cleanse her from black magic, she needed a sorcerer with the opposite gift. Rosie said that in that case he would be even more tired. He smiled and said that in fact there were more important problems. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that it was too unexpected. He looked at her closely and said that there are mandatory conditions for getting rid of black magic. Stay away from this place, and for a long time, it takes quite a lot of time and effort. Albert smiled and said that after all this, he wouldn't get by with a couple of days of feeling unwell, because that would be much more painful. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he was really telling her about it in such detail to make her feel guilty. He smiled and said that he was not doing it for that reason. He looked at the young lady intently and said that whatever she had done before, he could only accept it. She looked at him in surprise and asked what she would do for the patient. Albert said that one could think of something else, because there were several reasons why a person became infected with black magic. Initially, a person could have received a curse from another person, or he himself was a black magician, but the assumption that she was cursed did not make sense. The soul and the tool of a black magician must be in the same place. He looked at her closely and said that for this reason, it was most likely that she herself was a black magician. The young lady stood frozen in shock for a moment and could not utter a word. A moment later, she pushed the prince away from her and asked for a little time. He said that if that was the case, then everything fell into place. He smiled and said that the king, despite his hatred for him, did not dare to harm him, and even suddenly made an alliance with the sorcerer. Albert looked at the young lady intently and informed her that the black magician could use his power to manipulate people. The young lady was taken aback and wondered if Rose was a black magician. It wasn't that it was an incredible story for the young lady, but she thought that Rose probably just hadn't been fully fleshed out as an additional villainess. Albert looked at her intently and said the more the black magician uses his powers, the more harm he does to his body and also destroys his psyche. He sighed heavily and said that this could explain her sudden change. She looked closely at the young prince, as she knew that he had killed Rose according to the book, but now he suspected that she was a black magician, sighed, and said that memories come back, but people do not change. He looked at her with a smirk and said that she had always wanted him. Albert said that he didn't trust people just like that. The young lady froze in shock as he touched her neck. He looked at her intently and said that she should listen to him carefully. Albert sighed heavily and, stroking her head, said that he would try to trust her. The young lady was taken aback and looked at him in surprise, as she did not understand why his face had suddenly changed. He said that he would believe her and come out of the tower again. She was shocked and didn't understand what he was even thinking. She understood perfectly well that they had made a pact that when they got out, each would go their own way. She wondered what would happen if something happened to him outside the tower. Rose understood perfectly well that the main character does not die so easily, but the original story was slowly changing. She was shocked, because even knowing the danger to himself, he said that he trusted her. She looked at him intently and asked where he would go after leaving the tower. He said that he would like to go north, since it was the easiest place for mages to hide. She knew that he did not want to show his weakness, so he returned to the tower. She knew that if he cured her, he would be bedridden for a week. One lady sighed heavily and asked if everything would be okay, because he didn't like to show his illnesses to others. Albert looked closely at the young lady, and with a beaming smile, said that someone had told him earlier that this could be done. He smiled and said that, for this reason, he decided to trust this man. The young lady froze in shock and surprise on the spot. She could not utter a word. He smiled and said that he had thought long and hard about whether he would receive gratitude. She looked at him in surprise and asked if it was really that easy to trust her. He sighed heavily and said that she was asking very strange questions. The young lady, in turn, said that they had only just met, but he was already saying that he trusted her. He looked at her closely and said with a satisfied smile that seeing people's essences was easier than it seemed, so he knew how difficult it was to meet someone like her. And sometimes he wondered if she was the one he was looking for. Rose froze in shock. She was surprised and did not understand why he suddenly started talking about this. She knew that in the original, there was no word about him waiting for someone. He sighed heavily and said that it was really burdensome, because she was still thinking about leaving him. Albert looked at the young lady intently and said that he still had no intention of letting her go so easily. She was in shock and did not understand at all what he was talking about now, but, unfortunately, she could not resist the young prince. He looked into her beautiful eyes and called her with a smile. A moment later, he kissed the young lady tenderly, and he also announced that he was ready to fall for her. A few days later, the prince was getting ready for a journey. He looked at her closely and asked how she was feeling. The young lady, looking at the prince, said that she was ready. A moment later, she was taken aback as the young dragon crawled out of her cloak. Albert looked at the young lady closely and adjusted her cloak with a smile, and also said that he was warning her in advance that things could get even worse for her outside, because black magic was raging outside. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she heard him. She looked at the prince intently, for she knew that she must gather her strength and step forward with him. After deciding that they would go out and get treatment, she gave the soldiers a report for 2 weeks at a time. She was glad that they had maintained a close relationship. The report was written by the prince, forging her handwriting. She knew that for this reason, she just needed to get treatment and come back. A moment later, she sighed heavily as her head started to hurt again. Hyun looked at her intently and said that she had changed. Rose smiled and said that this was exactly how it was, so she was going to get cured. He said worriedly that she shouldn't get sick. Albert looked at them intently and said that it was time for them to set out. A moment later, the prince cast a spell, and they were transported to the roof. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that it would be faster this way. With lightning speed, he lifted her into his arms, but the young lady, in turn, did not have time to object to him. The young lady was amazed because they moved very quickly. She closed her eyes because she was very scared. The prince smiled and asked why she closed her eyes. She sighed heavily and said that I just looked down and got scared. Albert looked at her with a gentle smile and said that in that case, she should not take her eyes off him. The young lady froze in place in embarrassment. She looked at him and wondered if he realized the impact his words were having on her. She guessed that he probably knew how her heart sank when he said such words. She knew that he was excellent at managing other people. Rose sighed heavily and told the prince that he looked beautiful today. She knew it would make his heart flutter, because he loved compliments. He smiled and looked closely at the young lady and asked what was the reason for bothering her like that. She smiled and said that she just wanted to see his reaction, because every time he was the only one who made her emotional. He smiled and, looking away from her, said that he does it differently. Rose was shocked and screamed that even if he told her, she still wouldn't be able to do it again, and that it was very unfair on his part. He smiled and said that it was not so, and she would have succeeded. She asked him in surprise, "How?" Albert smiled predatorily and said that she should lean towards him. The young lady sighed heavily and pulled away from him, telling him not to joke like that. He smiled and said that he knew it wouldn't work out yet, and that she needed to try harder. She knew that living in the tower hadn't made him any less lonely, so he had become reckless. Sometime later, they arrived at the duchy. The young people were in shock, did not understand what was happening at all. The young lady, embarrassed by such close attention, asked the prince to let her go, but he told her not to struggle and to sit quietly. He looked at her intently and said that she should be closer to him so that he could control the black magic. Albert looked at her intently and asked if she remembered who had relieved her headache. A moment later, the young lady silently complied with his order. He looked at her intently and said with a smile that she was a clever girl. She was shocked as soon as she looked at the young people's gaze. She immediately felt uneasy. She was well aware that they considered her a terrible villain. Albert looked at everyone present and said that he understood perfectly well that they wanted an explanation, but he did not have time for it. Albert looked at the Duke intently and said that he trusted him. For this reason, he should do the same. The Duke bowed and said that he understood everything. The young lady looked closely at everyone present, as she could see their faces. She realized that they looked as if they had been wounded in the very heart. She sighed heavily as she realized that she was in a bad situation. She knew that Albert had decided to stop at the duchy while he treated her, and until he woke up again before returning to the tower. Hyun looked at the young lady closely and said that they were all very strange. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had not been sleeping. He smiled and said that he just did not feel like it. Hyun looked at the young lady with tears in his eyes and said that she shouldn't get sick, because she herself said that they would go on a trip. She smiled and asked if he was really that worried about her. Rose said with a smile that he shouldn't have done that. The Duke looked at the prince intently and asked if he would really treat the black magician. At the same time, the young lady sat quietly in bed and listened to their conversation. The prince smiled and said that it was all true, so they had better make room for them, because he needed to put up a barrier inside the room. The Duke looked at the prince closely and reported that the individual buildings had been prepared at his request, but he was puzzled and wondered if it was worth the effort. The prince sighed heavily and told the Duke that he had recently told him to trust him. The Duke was taken aback and said that it was the first time he had seen him like this. The prince sighed and said that something had happened to him, and the current black magic had a connection, and it would be best to find out everything personally. The Duke asked in surprise if it had anything to do with his imprisonment in the tower. The Duke said that even under torture, magic did not reveal the truth, so he asked for forgiveness for unnecessary doubt. The prince looked at him intently and said that he did not need to apologize for the justified suspicions at all, and he also said that the Duke could now go. The Duke bowed low and did everything as the prince said. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that there would be treatment, and first they had to remove the baby dragon. The young lady was taken aback, as she had not expected such a thing at all. She shouted that the dragon was not some kind of thing. The prince looked at the little dragon with a smile and said that he had forgotten about it, and they would not remove him, but you would see him out. The young lady looked at the prince intently, because she did not want him to leave. Albert sighed heavily and said that before starting, it was necessary to minimize the presence of living organisms, and he could not do anything about it. She sighed heavily, because now she understood what was being discussed. Rose looked at her dragon intently and said that she was going to have to undergo treatment. For this reason, they needed to be apart. Bursting into tears, the dragon said that he did not want this. Albert looked at the dragon closely and said that if he didn't leave, he wouldn't be able to cure her on the lady, which meant that her chance of death would increase. A moment later, the dragon jumped off the bed with lightning speed. He sighed and agreed with them. Rose looked closely at the prince and asked why he didn't like the dragon so much. Albert said that he had only negative experiences with dragons. She looked at him in surprise and asked if he had really seen adult dragons yet. He sighed heavily and said that that was exactly it. Albert said that when he was 8 years old, he was acquainted with a white dragon. Rose looked at him excitedly and asked where it happened. She knew perfectly well that the adult dragon that Albert met must know about a way to survive. He returned it, sighed, and said that the dragon was enormous in size, like a mountain. He sighed heavily and said that, unfortunately, he did not remember where he met him. The young lady sighed heavily, as she expected to hear something different. He said that he would like to meet him again, but the older the dragons are, the harder it is to see them again. The prince looked at the young lady with a smirk and said that for this reason he had no information for her dragon. She laughed and asked if it was that obvious. The prince smiled and said that, of course it was. Moments later, the young lady told the prince that she was ready for treatment. He sighed heavily and said that it was very good and he would start right away. He asked her to sit quietly because he had to draw the seal. She smiled and said that he did not need to worry because she did it better than anything in the world. She looked at the prince in surprise and wondered how he knew about everything. Rose read some literature about magic, but it was all to no avail. And in the end, she couldn't help him in any way, and she used to hate passive heroes. A moment later, the young lady was taken aback, as she realized that she could do something after all. She called the prince with a smile. She smiled and asked if he wanted something to eat. She knew he could do what he could do. She smiled and said that she would do everything when he finished, because he would lose his strength after the treatment, and in the morning she learned to cook a new dish. He smiled and said that anything would do for him, and if she cooked what she liked, he wouldn't refuse. She sighed heavily and said that he didn't like spicy food, and that she would have to be completely shameless to prepare such a dish for a sick person. He smiled and said that his taste had changed. The prince slowly approached her and said that now she should lie down. The young lady sighed heavily and did everything he told her. A moment later, Albert said, "Young lady," that he was beginning the treatment. After a few seconds, the young lady was enveloped in magic. She looked at the prince in surprise, asked if he was okay, as she saw that he was shaking. She asked if she should stay where she was, or if they could talk about something. The prince looked at her in surprise, as he did not expect this. A moment later, he sighed heavily and said that she could tell him something about herself. She looked at him in surprise, as she had not expected this. She did not know what to tell him. But a moment later, she said with a smile that before she started working, she went to the sea. Then she was incredibly happy, spent time in a place about which she knew nothing. And later, when hard times came, she returned to memories of the sea. She smiled and said that for this reason, she thought that traveling was very good. Rose, with a radiant smile, said that he should also go to the sea someday. But a moment later, one of them, taken aback and alarmed, called the prince. As she saw that he had become ill, she was very worried and asked if he was feeling unwell. The prince took her hand, breathing heavily. He told her that he knew she was thinking of moving away from him. She sighed heavily and said that everything was correct. Albert smiled a predatory smile and said that it seemed like she was not going to make excuses. He asked if she would answer if he asked about the reasons. Rose sighed heavily and said that no matter what she told him now, he would return the answer he wanted. She sighed heavily and said that she believed that his current feelings were temporary. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. The young lady said that he hated her from the beginning, but being locked up in the tower, there was no one to communicate with, and so he began to communicate with her. He sighed heavily and said that confinement had not killed his sense of beauty. Looking at the young lady, he asked if there were any other reasons. She was in shock, did not understand what was happening to him, because it seemed to her that she was talking to a wall. She understood perfectly well that he was having a very hard time because of his use of magic. She knew that he was not being sincere with her now. She looked intently at the prince, called him. Albert smiled and prepared to listen to her. She sighed heavily and said that she was a maid. He smiled and said that he knew it. Rose told him that she would live her whole life as a servant, and he as a member of the royal family. She took her hand away from him and, sighing heavily, said that she was afraid of the evil tongues of people. The prince was taken aback and froze in shock. He sighed heavily and said that he could make it so that this would not happen. She looked at him in surprise, as she did not expect this. Press sighed heavily and asked if she had any other reasons. Rose said that feelings can change. She sighed heavily and said that she was very afraid that he might start to hate her just as suddenly as he fell in love. This might happen after she gave him everything. Albert said with a smirk. Did she really think he would change, and she wouldn't hate him anyway? And that's why she was thinking about leaving. Albert looked at her intently and said that she wouldn't believe it, even if he said that he would understand, and that he hadn't changed. The prince slowly approached the young lady and said that he, of course, would not sit still and would allow her to try what she would do. He smiled a predatory smile and said that he knew how to wait, and he knew how to ask. He looked at her closely and said that even now he was holding back from begging or feigning illness. She was shocked because she understood that she could not refuse a truly sick person. A moment later, the prince was taken aback, as he felt ill. The young lady looked at the prince in surprise. She was puzzled by his condition, but after a few seconds he fell on her. The prince looked at the young lady intently and said that he would be very lucky if he did not have to wait too long. The young lady sighed heavily. She wondered what was happening to the prince. She looked at him intently and asked with a smile for permission to look after him, since it was because of her treatment that he was now in such a state. The prince sighed heavily and informed the young lady that the dragon was looking for her. In a hurry, she shouted that in that case she would quickly run and find him and return immediately. He sighed heavily and looked after her with a smile, but a moment later there was a knock on his door and a request for permission to enter. He realized that the Duke had come to visit him and allowed him to enter. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that he had heard that he had decided to stay here for about a week. The Duke asked the prince if he really wanted to do something. Albert looked at the Duke closely and asked if he was interested in why he had come back when he had left when he was offered to stay. Liam said that he was not particularly interested. The prince looked at the young man closely and said that he would like to meet with the mages. The Duke was shocked. He said that there was a danger of revealing his current location. If he went personally, the Duke told the prince that he could continue to entrust him with this. Albert sighed heavily and said that it was black magic and it was too risky, because if everything went to the Duke, something would happen and they would lose their advantage. Albert looked at the Duke closely and said that he knew better who used black magic. The Duke sighed heavily, but still agreed. Albert said that the tower was under a chaos spell, so the king should not suspect anything. Albert said that he had stopped here under the pretext of healing, and that they would go to the northern prison every dawn, and all this must remain a strict secret. The Duke looked at the prince intently and said that no one would know that he had gone to meet the captured sorcerers, predicted that it was quite easy to recognize those whose soul and body were perishing due to black magic, and the arrested were aware whether there was such a person among them. The prince said that it was possible to tear the body apart and extract at least some information. The duke sighed heavily and, bowing, said that he would prepare everything. The prince sighed heavily and thought that he would most likely have to stay in bed for several days tomorrow. He sighed heavily and said that he was fine. The lady looked at him in bewilderment. He said that it was better to be alone to recover faster. She said that he could call her at any time. She looked at him intently and said that in that case he could rest. Albert smiled and thanked her for such obedience, because in any case he would have to lie down for a whole week. He smiled and said that she should also have a good rest. The prince understood that although it was a long process, full restoration took 4 days. He saw that the magic grew even more. He had long ago discovered that if he used it almost to the limit, then after long torments, when the whole body seemed to be burned by fire, the magic returned and it became much stronger. He was very upset that the process would take more days this time. He knew he needed a whole week. He understood perfectly well that he needed to extract as much information as possible from the magicians. He understood perfectly well that he had to find a clue to this all along by any means necessary. Albert, in turn, really wanted all this not to happen. But he knew that if the young lady had a dark past, he was going to bury it. And that was the main reason they were here. He understood perfectly well that she could be a black magician. But he knew he wouldn't let anyone know about it first. The young lady slowly returned to her room. She was a little surprised, as the prince called her dragon by name, which he did not love at all. He said he needed time to rest alone. She wanted to find the dragon while the prince was recovering. She slowly wandered around the castle in search of the dragon. She thought that everything was very strange, because she had not seen him for a long time. She wandered around for some time in search, but unfortunately, it was all in vain since she could not find him. A moment later, she stumbled and bumped into the duke. The young lady froze for a moment, not expecting to see him. The duke looked at her with cold fury and said that she must get out of the way. The young lady was taken aback and said that she would leave now. The duke glanced sideways at the young lady, who was running away in a hurry. He watched her for a while as she was busy looking for her dragon. The duke looked closely at the young lady and informed her that the servant would take her to the room. If she did not want to discredit the prince's name, then she had better obey. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she had to find the cat, and she also wanted something to eat. For this reason, she tried to find the kitchen. The duke froze for a moment as she wanted to find the cat and the kitchen. He sighed heavily and said that she could do whatever she wanted, and he also informed her that the cat had recently been taken by Schubert. The young lady thanked the duke with a smile for what he had told her. Some time later, she headed towards the eastern garden. The man looked at her intently and, asking for forgiveness, said that the baron said no one should enter. The young lady was taken aback, as she did not expect to hear such a thing. In turn, she was slowly seething with anger and fury. She looked intently at the man and said that the baron had taken her cat. She understood perfectly well that if the baron did not want to see her, then she would not want to meet him either, because she had only come for her dragon. Rose looked at the young man intently and asked if he could convey her words to Harrow. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really looking for a cat. She smiled and said that he should pass on her words and louder. The young man sighed heavily and said that he didn't know that cats could understand long phrases, but he decided to do it anyway. The young man said in a puzzled tone that the young lady was going to eat something delicious with Hyan. She smiled and said that maybe he would come. Some time later, the young man said with a puzzled smile that cats still didn't understand such speech. But a moment later, he was taken aback, as he himself saw the cat who came to her mistress. Hyan joyfully jumped into the arms of the young lady and asked with a smile if she had really come to him. She looked at him in surprise and asked why he was there. Hyan said that the man told him that he would give him some treats. The young lady was shocked. She shouted to her pet that he shouldn't follow someone just because he promised to give him something tasty, because the person could be dangerous. He smiled and said that he was good. A moment later, the baron came out to them and looked intently at the young lady and asked if she was talking about him. The young lady was taken aback and said that it was not so, and he really was nice. She was just talking about strangers in general. He sighed heavily and said that she had gotten out of it after all. He looked at him intently and asked if she was behaving the same way towards the prince. The young lady saw his angry look. Rose looked at him intently because she realized that his gaze was like that of a big dog. A moment later, she looked around. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was doing. She came closer to him with the speed of lightning and said that she was now planning to cook the prince his favorite food. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. She smiled and said that she would like to let him try what she would do. Rose asked with a smile if he would let her do it. He sighed heavily and asked how he knew there would be no poison in it. He said that, unfortunately, he couldn't trust her completely. She sighed heavily and said that she understood him. A moment later, the young lady said that in that case she could not do anything and she would have to do everything herself. The Baron was taken aback and asked the young lady to wait. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going to just leave. The young lady looked sideways at the young man with a playful smile because she thought that he would hold out longer, but everything turned out to be much simpler. She smiled and asked how she could force him. Rose knew perfectly well that it had long been known that human relations require a push-pull method for effectiveness. At the same time, Hyun called out to the young lady with a joyful smile. He wanted to know what she would cook today. She smiled and asked her pet what he wanted to eat. The Baron looked at the young lady in surprise, but a moment later said that he would like to go with her. Sometime later they came to the kitchen. The young lady was looking for spices in a hurry. She looked at Madame closely and asked if they had any seafood, as she would like shrimp, crab, mussels, or octopus. Madame smiled and said that the Duke loved them very much, so he always kept them in stock. Rose said with a smile that it was very good. The young lady looked at the Baron in bewilderment and asked why he didn't leave. He sighed heavily and said with embarrassment that he had to personally check whether she had continued to put poison in the prince's food. She smiled and said that it was a very reasonable excuse on his part. The young lady knew perfectly well that it was a very good excuse. He looked away from her in embarrassment and said that she was not a witch, but rather stupid. Rose sighed heavily and said that she thought it would be nice to be a fool, much better than a witch. The Baron looked at her in surprise, but said nothing. He walked intently around her and watched the whole process. Baron sighed heavily and asked if she was really making a lump of flour for His Highness. Rose sighed heavily and asked the Baron if he was not here to help. She knew that now she had to tear the dough, but she had been preparing the ingredients for so long that her hands were falling off. He sighed heavily and said that knights do not cook. She looked at him furiously and asked if this meant that he did not want to see the prince's contented face during the meal. A moment later, the young man was preparing to cook. She looked closely at the young Baron, for he reminded her of the naive boy who had not encountered society. She looked at him closely, wondering how he was related to the prince. Rose slowly approached the Baron and asked if she could ask him a question. Schubert looked at her in surprise and asked what she wanted to know. The young lady sighed heavily and asked him why he respected the prince so much. The Baron sighed heavily as memories came flooding back to him. A moment later, he said that the prince had saved his life. Rose looked closely at the young man. She understood that this was a very good reason for him to respect the prince. She saw that he was showing with his whole appearance that she should not raise this topic and should leave him alone. A moment later, the young lady's expression changed, and, approaching the Baron with a smile, she said that now she needed to tear off a little of the dough and put it on the frying pan. He sighed heavily and said that he understood everything. A moment later, he began to do everything under her guidance. After they finished cooking, they slowly walked towards the prince. She sighed heavily and said that he had personally seen her cooking, so she hoped that she had managed to dispel his suspicions about poison in the food. Rose looked askance at the young man and asked if there was anything else he wanted to make sure of. The young man sighed heavily and said that he did not intend to do that yet. She smiled and said that it was very wonderful. After a few seconds, the young lady's expression changed, and with a joyful smile, she thanked the Baron for looking after Hyun. The young man froze for a moment, as he was embarrassed by her words. Entering the prince's room, the young lady was taken aback for a moment, as she thought he was sleeping. She froze and looked intently at the prince and the duke. They brought the baggage and told her that he felt sick in the lying position, so he tried to buy more time. He smiled and said that it was a surprise to him to see her awake, and he noticed that she looked exhausted. She smiled and said that she was hungry. She looked at the Duke intently and said with a smile that thanks to the Duke's kindness in providing her with the ingredients and the kitchen, she was able to cook everything and bring it to them. The prince smiled and asked what she had cooked. Rose said with a happy smile that she had made dumpling soup. She said that it was made with seafood broth containing pieces of wheat dough. She said that it was very refreshing, and the dumplings added a wonderful taste. The prince looked at her in bewilderment and said that the soup was warm. He did not understand how it could be refreshing. The young lady sighed heavily, as she understood that only true Koreans could understand this. She sighed heavily and said that she had misspoken, and that it was probably because of his overly dazzling appearance that it happened. The prince sighed with a smile and said that it seemed that such treatment was nothing new to her. The Duke looked at them in surprise and asked if they always spoke like that. Rose said with a joyful smile that everything was exactly like that, because she admired the prince's appearance very much and served him delicious food. She looked at them intently and said that she did not resort to any tricks or cause harm, and as a devoted servant, she did not hide anything. A moment later, the prince looked intently at the Baron and called him. The Baron was taken aback and looked intently at the prince. Albert smiled and told the Baron that he had heard. He had managed to spread false information and the king's knights. He smiled and said that it was a very good job on his part. The Baron, with a joyful smile, told the prince that he was ready to move mountains for him. The young lady looked at everyone present. She understood that since they were talking about this, it was high time for her to leave them. She looked at them intently, without smiling, said that she would go. The prince looked at her in surprise and asked where she was going to eat. Rose smiled and said that she would do it in the kitchen. He looked at her intently and asked how about having dinner together. A moment later, her dragon was enjoying the delicious food with a joyful smile. The young lady, in turn, was a little puzzled. She did not understand how she ended up in such a group. She looked at the prince intently and said that the dumpling soup was best eaten warm. He had his own and thanked her. She looked at everyone present and said that they should try it too. The Duke looked at the soup warily. As it was the first time he had seen such food, Schubert said that he was sure there was no poison in it. The Baron was surprised, because he did not think that wheat dough could be so tasty. The Duke in turn said that it was very surprising, because with each spoon he understood that this food was very good. The Duke said that in order to prepare something edible for the prince, you have to be a pretty skilled cook. The Baron was well aware that the prince was constantly changing cooks. The prince looked at everyone present with a joyful smile and said that thanks to young Lena, everything was fine with him now, and he didn't even have the feeling that he was locked up. Rose understood perfectly well that this was her chance. She looked at the Duke intently and said that she would like to ask him something. He looked at her in surprise and said that she could ask questions. She smiled, wondering if there was a library in the estate, because she wanted to know if she could read books in it. She understood perfectly well that now she would not only need to rely on the prince, but also solve problems on her own. The Duke looked at her in surprise and asked what books she was talking about. Rose said she would like to know more about ordinary and black magic, as well as about dragons. The Duke said that because literature on black magic was banned in the tomes, it was only touched upon superficially. He looked at her intently, said that there was similar information in other books, and tomorrow he would send a servant to accompany her to the library. The young lady thanked him with a joyful smile. She saw that his departure was cold, but still definitely changed compared to previous meetings. She thought that most likely he liked the dumpling soup more than she thought. The Duke said that he did not know how she got sick with black magic, but it was in their jurisdiction, so she could not worry, because they would definitely solve this issue. He looked at her intently and said with cold fury that black magic must die. She looked at the Duke intently because she understood what was being discussed. She knew that knowledge was power, and in order not to die, she absolutely had to find out everything. The prince looked at them closely and asked with a smile how the preparations were going. The Duke said that the knights were doing an excellent job of managing public opinion. The prince looked at the Baron closely and said with a smile that he was a good man. because the day before yesterday he had said that it was absolutely necessary to appear there. The Baron sighed heavily and told the prince that he was not that influential, and besides, he was not very well trained. The Duke looked at them in surprise and asked if the citizens' opinions were not positive. He asked if there was no method in mind, since he thought that it should be used. The Duke looked at the prince intently and asked if he really wanted this. The young lady looked at them intently. She knew it didn't look like they were talking about anything secret in front of her. She thought it was impolite for her to stay with them. A moment later, she said it was very late, so she was going to the kitchen and she would clean up on the way. A moment later, the prince took her hand and asked her to stay. Rose looked at the prince in bewilderment, as she did not expect this. The prince looked closely at the young men and said that they had better go too, because his powers also had limits. The young men understood everything and immediately bowed out. For some time after, they sat silently in the room. Rose looked at the prince with a smile and asked if she could go. Albert looked at the young lady intently and said with a smile that he had something to tell her, so they should go to the room together. The young lady in turn came to the prince's room late in the evening, as ordered. She was puzzled, because she did not know what he was going to say, since he called her separately, and at the same time ordered her to wait. She wondered if he had been preparing what was there. A moment later, the prince opened the door, and the young lady froze in shock. He looked at her intently and said that she could come in. Rose froze in place in surprise and blinded by his radiance and beauty. She sighed heavily, as she knew perfectly well that she couldn't show him her face covered in drool. Having asked for forgiveness, she quickly rushed into his room. The prince looked at her with a smile. A moment later, the prince slowly approached the young lady. She was frozen in shock as he pinned her against the door. She didn't understand what he wanted or why he kept doing things like this. She said sheepishly that he had not put on his usual clothes today. She knew that she should behave calmly, because if she reacted, it would seem very strange to him. But he was so dressed up that it was stressing her out. She was shocked and wondered if he was really going to seduce her. Albert looked at her intently and, stroking her head with a radiant smile, said that he put on a robe because he would sweat a lot during sleep. But this way, it was more comfortable for him, because last time, everything was exactly like this. She was taken aback and froze in embarrassment as she realized the reason why he had changed his clothes. She was glad that he dressed differently in the tower, because she didn't know what would happen if he dressed like that every day. The young lady, in turn, cast all thoughts of the prince away, because she understood that it was very dangerous. She looked at him intently and with a smile expressive force. Why did he call her? She wanted to know if he really wanted something from her. Albert looked at her intently and said that they would not talk about black magic anymore. Rose looked at him in surprise and asked if she was a black magician. Shouldn't she at least clarify everything? Rose said that the truth is that the current king could have been manipulated. And this is a very important point. Alberto sighed angrily and said that therefore she should not talk about it, and it would be better for him to pass on the information from her. See? She sighed evilly and said that it seemed that the fact that she was a black magician had brought more problems than one might think. The prince sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly like that. A moment later, he looked at her intently and said that the black magician would be executed as soon as his identity was revealed. The young lady sighed heavily. She realized that if it were not for this, she would have been dead long ago. She understood that it would be wrong for the prince, who would soon be ruling the country, to touch personal feelings. She looked at the prince intently and asked if he was being too lenient with her. Albert smiled and said that she shouldn't worry about such things, because he not only cared about her, he smiled and said that it seemed that she was very worried that he might become a death later. She sighed heavily and said that he was very perceptive, and nothing could be hidden from him. He smiled and said that it was not so much perceptiveness. Albert smiled and said that it would be more correct to say that he simply watched her long and carefully. Rose looked at the prince intently and asked him what he would do if she really turned out to be bad. She knew perfectly well what would happen if he did tell. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she was talking about. He sighed heavily and said that he would pursue her to the end, because he was very vindictive. He came closer to her and, pressing her against the door, said that when she ran away, she should think about what she would say when they met again. The young lady, in turn, froze in place from embarrassment. She understood perfectly well that she had to do everything so that she would not have to run away. Sometime later, the young lady was sleeping quietly in bed with the dragon. She was puzzled because the image of the prince with his luxurious chest would not leave her mind. She was puzzled and wondered if he was not indebted to God. She sighed heavily and threw all her thoughts away. She remembered him telling her that she should not be talked about in any more conversations about black magic. She knew that he had called her precisely because he did not want her to spread such things and wanted to warn her. She sighed, knowing that now was not the time to think about him, as she felt guilty. She knew perfectly well that she had to find out how the true owner of the body became a black magician. She knew that they were usually executed immediately, completely destroyed. The young lady was alarmed and did not understand how the real mistress could hide her identity because she was just an ordinary maid. She did not understand how Rose could know about black magic. She wondered if the girl had a teacher, in which case she was very keen to know how the young girl met him. The young lady sighed heavily, for she knew that she had fallen asleep yesterday, thinking about meaningless things. She knew that she had to meet the prince first. A moment later, the young lady bumped into the Baron. He looked at the young lady and her cat in surprise. She looked at him in surprise and called out. The Baron asked in bewilderment what had happened. Rose said that she came to inquire what to cook, and also wanted to court. The Baron said that the prince ordered to let her in, and if she needed, then she could go in. She smiled and thanked the Baron. The young lady looked at her dragon and asked him if he would stay here or go with her. He said he would stay here because it was scary there. She smiled and asked the defense to look after her pet. The Baron was taken aback and asked if she was really assigning him work now. He looked closely at the beautiful cat and also told Rose that the prince's nanny was in the room. Rose looked at the Baron intently and asked if they could take care of the prince together. The Baron said that it was up to her to decide. Rose slowly entered the room and saw Madame. Madame looked at the lady with a hint of hostility. Rose greeted Madame with a smile and also said that she was the one who was taking care of the prince. Greta looked at the young lady with a wary, intent look and informed her that she was His Highness's nurse and that he had told her to look after him. The young lady smiled and said that the prince had asked her to come to him yesterday morning. Greta looked at the young lady with cold fury and asked what she was talking about. Madame smiled and told the young lady that she seemed to have taken the prince's empty chatter seriously. Rose looked at Madame in surprise and said that she heard sincerity in his words. The madam looked at the young lady with a sneer and said that she had only spent a few months with him in the tower, and she had been looking after him since he was a child. She looked at the young lady with a smirk and asked who she thought knew the prince better. Rose's face fell for a moment, unable to answer such a question. But a moment later, she said that she believed that it was not measured by time. She said that she thinks that even in a short meeting, you can become the whole world for someone. Madame, in turn, looked at the young lady with cold fury. But a moment later, she said that if she had known in what state she had found the prince, she would not have said such a thing. She looked at the young lady with fury and asked if she really thought that few people were taken in by his looks. Rose sighed heavily and said that, of course, the prince was very handsome, but she was not lying. She looked at Madame intently, not understanding what she was talking about at all, since she knew perfectly well that she had not been led by his appearance at all. She looked intently at the sleeping prince. The madam turned on the young lady with fury and said that even now she was burning him with her gaze. The young lady was taken aback and cried out that everything was wrong. She understood perfectly well that he was indeed handsome, but she had no selfish intentions. She understood that the prince's nanny was not going to listen to her anyway. She sighed heavily and said that, however, she had simply come at the prince's command, and that Madame had driven her away. Greta sighed heavily and asked what was wrong with that. She said that the prince was not the type to pay attention to such trifles. Rose turned around and said with a smile that she didn't think so. She also said, Madam, that she should remember this conversation, because the prince she was courting attached importance to every matter. She took one last look at the prince, who was writhing in pain. The servant looked at the young lady intently and asked with a smile on his face if something had happened. She sighed heavily and said that it was not so. A moment later, The young lady's expression changed, and she asked with a smile where the Baron and her cat were. Rose smiled and said that she had entrusted her cat to the Baron. The young man smiled and said that the Baron had recently played with her, so they had swapped. He looked at the young lady intently and said that if there was anything she needed, he could help her. A moment later, she cried out that of course she needed something. He looked at her in surprise and asked what she needed now. Since he saw that her face had changed, she looked intently at the young man and with a smile asked him to take her to his office. A moment later, they were walking slowly towards their destination along the long corridors. She looked around in surprise and asked the young man if this was really the way to the kitchen. He smiled and said that it was absolutely correct. She smiled because she knew that she had to prepare something tasty for a snack a little later. She knew that even the nanny would not be able to stop her from passing the food to the prince. Rose knew perfectly well that she could argue with the nanny and just stay there, but she still did not want to do such a thing. She remembered the way the prince had stared at her when he had pinned her against the wall. Then she timidly and quietly asked if she could handle magic. The prince was taken aback and looked at her in surprise, and also asked why she needed it. The young lady hesitated, not knowing what to answer. In turn, she really wanted to study her because she was the new Rose Adius. Even if Albert guaranteed her a pension and land, her status would not change. But she had a body with which she could see the true appearance of the little dragon. She knew perfectly well that this would give her a chance to protect herself, and later, perhaps, she would be able to help him. The prince looked at the young lady in surprise, as he had not expected to hear such a thing at all. But a moment later, he said with a smile that they could try. The young lady, in turn, knew that there was a very big difference between talent and the abilities that magicians were born with. She understood perfectly well that she had to make every effort to make everything work out for her. She understood perfectly well that there were books in the tower, but there weren't many of them, so while she was at the Duke's estate, she had to read more. A moment later, the young man said with a smile that they had already arrived, and also asked the young lady if he could help her with her search. She smiled and said that she would first look around. He wished her a pleasant time with a smile. She looked around carefully, as she thought that the library would definitely have books about magic. A moment later, she was taken aback as she heard the Duke's voice telling her that she must stop. He looked at her intently and asked what brought her here. She looked at the Duke intently and, trembling with fear, said that, as she had already said yesterday, she had come to find books about magicians and dragons. He looked at her in surprise and said that the prince had recently called her to him. She smiled and said that the nurse was very stubborn, and for that reason she had thrown her out. The Duke sighed heavily as Madame was at it again. Rose looked at the Duke with a smile and said that she would go again in the evening, because it was the prince's order. He looked closely at the young lady and asked how she planned to live once she left the tower. The young lady, in turn, looked at the Duke with bewilderment, since she did not understand why he was suddenly asking her about such a thing. She knew that everyone around thought that she had clung to the prince and would make unlawful demands of him. Rose sighed heavily and told the Duke that she understood perfectly well what he was worried about. He looked at her in surprise and asked how she could know what he was worried about if he hadn't told her anything. Rose knew perfectly well that the Duke was not one to open his soul after one meal, and she was fine with the fact that he obviously did not trust her at all. But she knew that in this situation, this fact could be useful. She really enjoyed spending time with the prince, but she knew that it was impossible to live as his lover. Liam looked at the young lady intently and said with fury that he did not know how she, standing in front of him, could influence the prince, and he did not know if this influence would be good. The young lady sighed heavily and said that the prince was a very good man, and she knew it very well, and she also knew very well that she was not at all suitable for him. She looked at the Duke intently and asked if she said she wanted to leave quietly. Would he help her? Liam looked at her in surprise and asked if she really wanted to leave. Rose sighed heavily, and with a puzzled smile, said that everything was true, and she would like to go to a place where she would not meet a prince. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really going to commit a crime against the prince. The young lady sighed heavily and said that it was not so. She knew that if she didn't go far enough, he would follow her. The Duke sighed heavily and looked intently at the young lady, but said nothing. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really such a skilled cook. She was taken aback and looked at the Duke in bewilderment, as she did not expect such a question. Rose sighed heavily as she realized that he really liked the cells that she had prepared earlier. She took up the skirt, said that she was a very skilled cook. The Duke thought for a moment and said that he seemed to have recently come across rumors about a man who cooked the same kind of food. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he would think about her proposal anyway. The young lady looked at him in bewilderment. He smiled and said that he would certainly consider helping her escape. Liam looked at the young lady closely and said that he could not promise, as it was very difficult to hide from the prince's sight. The young lady, in turn, thanked the Duke with a smile. Some time later, she slowly looked through all the books in search of what she needed. But unfortunately, she couldn't find anything like that. And a moment later, she decided to ask the Duke for help. She asked what book he was looking for. The Duke sighed heavily and said that he was looking for a book about dragons. After his words, the young lady lit up and looked at him intently. The Duke said that a dying cub had appeared in the capital. The young lady, in turn, froze in shock and asked what he was talking about. She was puzzled and asked if he was really saying that a baby had appeared in the city and that it was dying. He glanced sideways at her and said that he remembered that she, too, seemed to be interested in them. The Duke looked at the young lady and asked her why she was interested in such a thing. The young lady was taken aback and stood still in shock. She did not know what to do and wondered if she should tell him about her dragon. She was shocked because he suddenly spoke about such a thing, and for this reason she was very worried about the dragon, because something could happen to him. He slowly approached her, and taking the book, said that she did not have to answer the question asked. Rose looked intently at the Duke, as she understood that she had to get information about dragons by any means. She looked intently at him and said that she knew one dragon cub. The Duke asked in surprise if this meant that she had powers. He sighed heavily and said that, judging by the fact that she was going to learn magic, it still hadn't manifested itself. The young lady looked away from him and said that it was exactly like that. Liam said that he was looking for this book in order to check what happens when a dragon dies. The young lady looked at him with alarm and asked if something happened when they died. He sighed heavily and asked if she hadn't come to read books. A moment later, he slowly handed her the book and told her to find out for herself. She looked at him intently as she received the book, but said nothing. Some time later, the young lady began to read. She was puzzled because she never thought about the death of her dragon. More precisely, she had no intention of thinking about such a thing at all. She had heard how easily baby dragons died, but she just wanted her dragon to always be by her side. She knew very well how old he was now. She knew that, for that reason, she couldn't always pretend that she didn't know that he could die at any moment. In the book called The History of Dragons, there was also information that the prince had already told her. It was written there how painful it was to make a contract with a dragon. There were also many reasons why baby dragons die, and naturally, she learned a few new things from the book. The closer the dragon was to its anniversary, the lower the probability of dying. But after that, terrible pains similar to death awaited it. After the death of the cub, its corpse makes the surrounding mana unstable and serves as a catalyst for disaster. It was like their final agony. Therefore, the cubs that do not survive their anniversary will disappear, leaving behind a catastrophe as evidence of their existence. The young lady looked at the Duke intently and said that he had previously told her that there was already a dying dragon. She asked what could help him stay alive. The Duke sighed heavily and said that if there was someone who would make a contract, he would thus help the dragon. Liam said that it was all for the prince's sake, because the disaster would have a major impact on the kingdom. Liam looked at Rose closely and said that it seemed like she wanted to make a pact with the dragon. He said that in that case, she should stay away from the cubs so that they wouldn't get sucked in and die. Rose said that it was not so, and it would be better if her familiar hatchling successfully grew up, much bigger and better than the dragon on the cover of the book. Rose looked at him intently and asked if she would save her dragon if she became a mage. He looked at her intently, but said nothing. A moment later, a servant burst in, and they noticed that she was worried. She looked intently at the lady and said that the prince was looking for her. Rose looked at her puzzledly and asked if she had seen the Baron and her cat. She looked at Rose intently and said that she would look for them. But first, she needed to see the prince. Rose noticed that she looked out of breath, so she wondered if something had happened to the prince to have him find her so quickly. A moment later, Rose slowly entered the prince's room and called him. The young lady looked at the prince intently, as she now guessed why the favor was in such a hurry. Because without an emotional expression on the prince's face, everyone around him was very frightened. She wondered if he was angry because she did not come in the morning, but she knew very well that it was not her fault. The young lady was taken aback and trembling, and told the prince that she had recently met his nanny. He came closer to her, and with lightning speed covered her mouth with his hand, and also informed her that he knew about everything. But still, he said that she broke her promise. The young lady was shocked and did not understand when she managed to break her promise. She froze and looked at the prince with embarrassment. A moment later, he stroked her face tenderly. He slowly approached her and quietly whispered in her ear, asking if he should say something that she knew perfectly well herself. The young lady said sheepishly that she felt it would be even worse to quarrel with the nanny when he was in such a state. She looked at the prince intently and said that in a situation like this, she had done her best, and time was not always a factor. She understood perfectly well that she could, as usual, adapt to his mood, because it was more convenient to retreat than to quarrel. But she knew that he considered her special. She understood that she could not continue to make concessions to him, because he liked not her, but the submissive image of Rose. Rose looked at the prince intently, and asking for forgiveness, said that she could not just smile and come. He looked at her in surprise and asked if she was really saying that she had done everything possible. The young lady looked at him in surprise and asked if he was okay. He smiled and said he was not. The prince looked at her with a beaming smile and said that he had told her before not to apologize because he liked it better that way. She was taken aback and asked if this was really all because of that. He smiled and said that, as she had said earlier, time was not always of the essence, so he was jealous. He smiled and said that it was because she didn't know him better than anyone else, because the nanny had sent her away and didn't even think to come and tell her about it. He was furious because she did not want to disturb the sick prince. He looked at her intently and asked for forgiveness with a smile, and also said that he apparently was not feeling well, and that was why he had reasoned hastily. She looked at him in surprise and quietly asked why he had behaved so recently. The prince sighed heavily and said that it was a little unfair that she made him impatient while she remained calm. He looked at the young lady intently and said that he had not forgotten the terms of the contract at all, and he knew he had to stop being capricious. Some time later, as they sat quietly at the table, the lady looked intently at the prince and asked where his nanny had gone. Albert said he sent her out to dinner and clear her head. The young lady smiled and said that she even understood her behavior. She said that a man and a woman were alone in the tower, and she didn't know who in their right mind would take it very well. He looked closely at the young lady and said that it seemed she was afraid of the whispers. She sighed heavily and said that it was exactly like that. Albert sighed heavily and said that, as she had said earlier, rumors were easy to spread, but it was just as easy to provoke people. He looked at her closely and said that if she was worried about gossip about herself, he would quickly fix it. She sighed heavily and said that bad rumors were not easily changed to good ones. A moment later, the prince's face changed, and he informed her that it was enough to know one way. She looked at the prince closely, as she had the feeling that he had been through this several times before. She thought for a moment, remembering the original story. Rose remembered that the king was spreading false rumors and turning people against each other. After escaping from the tower, the prince's reputation was not bad. She was surprised and puzzled, as she did not know how he managed to change the rumors about himself. She suddenly remembered the Duke and their conversation back then. Now she understood their words. She looked at the prince closely and asked if they had really used rumors, but asked if he could tell her what rumors he had decided to spread. Rose smiled nervously and said that she would find out about everything sooner or later, anyway. The prince sighed heavily and said that it would be better if she found out everything as late as possible. He said that he really wanted to buy the sympathy of all people. The prince sighed heavily and said with a smile that when they learned that he was no different from them, although they considered him superior, they became very lenient towards him. He smiled and said that he wanted to remain the perfect man for her for as long as possible. Rose sighed and looked away from him in embarrassment, and also informed him that he could not tell her about it because she did not force him. Albert looked at her intently and thanked her. A moment later, he looked at her closely and said that she had gone to the office. He said that it seemed that she already knew, if she had been looking for information about dragons, what this hatchling next to her was about to endure. The young lady stood frozen for a moment. She did not answer him. Albert looked at her intently and asked when approximately she planned to send it. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. Albert said that he did nothing because he believed and waited for her to make her own decision. He said that she would meet other people when she got out of the tower, so there was no reason to raise him. The young lady was shocked because she knew that Albert was well aware of why she took the dragon for herself. But now everything had changed, and it was no longer because of loneliness. Albert looked at her intently and asked why she did not answer. He repeated his question again and asked when she would let him go. The young lady froze for a moment. She didn't know what to answer him. She knew perfectly well that if she were to avoid this situation and say that she was breaking up with the dragon, it would be the same as if she were leaving him right now. She was puzzled because she didn't know how to answer such a question. He looked at her intently and called out again. The young lady, in turn, said that she wanted to see him as an adult. She smiled and said that for that reason, she wondered if it would be dangerous for her to sign a contract with him. The prince looked at the young lady with cold fury and bewilderment and asked what she was talking about. Gathering her courage, she shouted once more that she wanted to make a contract with him. She knew that, compared to the description in the book, she had to go through torment. She knew that the future in which they would have to part was much more real. But now she knew about the torment he would go through. She could not remain indifferent. The young lady sighed heavily and said that she could learn magic. She wanted to try really hard and become a magician in a year. She looked at the prince intently and said that it didn't mean there was no possibility. He sighed heavily and said with cold fury that it seemed she hadn't read the books properly. Rose looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, the prince snapped his fingers, and with the help of magic, he summoned the book to him. She was surprised because she noticed that it was the same book she had read earlier. He looked at her closely and said that she should read the part about the contract carefully. Albert looked at the young lady intently and said that the body that makes the contract is also subjected to torment, and in this process, each person has their own pain. He looked at her closely and sighed heavily and said that it lasts for a month until the dragon is fully formed. A moment later, the young lady's expression changed, and she said with a smile that she had found something. She smiled and said that it said that if all the torments were overcome, the body of the one who made a contract with the dragon would be brought closer to that of a demigod. He looked at her intently and said that she must read it all properly. Albert said that it also says that while the dragon is changing, he should not ask for help from others. They find places where they can be alone. The lady sighed heavily and said that she intended to do it anyway. Albert said that he could not watch her throw herself into the thick of things. He sighed heavily and said that perhaps it would be better to experience it for himself. She looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. He said that there was a dying baby dragon. Albert said that she could go and see for herself how scorched the area was. The young lady was taken aback, but the principal looked at her intently and said that it was an order. Some time later, the prince lay in his bed in pain. He was puzzled because he knew that he would never get used to such pain. But in turn, he was glad that it all started after the young lady left. He knew that even if it seemed like the body was completely burned in the fire, the bones were broken and reassembled. Sometimes he thought that it would be better for him to just die. Albert understood perfectly well that the man who had made a contract with the dragon was going through torment 100 times worse than his own. He was furious because he knew that her body could not withstand even black magic, and she herself went to help the dragon make a contract with him. He was puzzled because they had not been together for very long, but he had already become attached to her, and she, in turn, had become very attached to the dragon and was ready to make a sacrifice for him. He understood that she would see everything herself and feel all the pain. He understood perfectly well that if the time was right, she would not do what was needed. Then all that would remain would be to replay the past in a circle, like his stupid childhood. The next day, the prince woke up with a headache. The duke entered his room and asked the prince if he had summoned him. Albert sighed heavily and asked the duke what news there was of the dragon hatchling. Liam informed the prince that she had confirmed that he was in Gettendor. The duke said that, based on the report from the right magician there, he heard a special cry. Looking at the princes, the duke said that a cry that would rip the eardrums indicated death within a week. The duke said it was a blue dragon, and he was more responsive than they thought. The prince looked at him in surprise and asked what he was talking about. The duke said that he seemed to consider this a chance to take revenge on the marquise. The prince said with a smile that he would be in the know. Unlike some, the duke said that almost 500 years had passed, but they said that the marquise had attacked him. The duke said that by crossing the past and the dimension, the dragon is the only creature capable of changing the present and reality, and in order for their number to increase, concessions are needed. The prince smiled and said that, however, in the case of the marquis, he thought that he simply did not restrain his greed. The true king's confidant, the marquise, always wanted to be a mage, but mana was not enough, so he wanted a dragon even more, which would allow him to become a demigod. The fate of the cub presented before the marquise is obvious, but the prince understood perfectly well that it was much more important that it would not only be the marquise who would suffer from this. He looked at his friend and said that the consequences would also affect the king. The duke said that everything was exactly like that, and this was an excellent chance to bring the treason closer. A moment later, the duke said that he would personally go to the crash site. Albert sighed heavily and said that everything would go as planned, but there would be one more task for him. The prince glanced sideways at his friend and said with a grin that he must take her to the capital and personally show her the scene of the disaster. The duke looked at the prince in bewilderment, as he did not understand why he had forgiven him. Albert looked at his friend intently and said that the young lady was going to make a contract with the dragon. The duke was shocked. He did not understand how the man locked in the tower wanted to make a contract with the dragon. Moments later, he was taken aback and remembered her words, because she said that if she became a magician, she would be able to make a contract with a dragon. She then asked if she would be able to save his dragon friend. The duke was furious, as he knew that the prince must not know that he had met the maid in the study and was talking to her. Albert said that the attacking cat next to the young lady was actually her dragon. Albert said that she believed that the feeling of separation from the dragon was much worse than the unbearable pain. The duke was shocked, because he now realized that her words were not empty at all. He knew that she had read the entire book to the end, and she knew perfectly well about the torment of the one who had entered into a contract. He was amazed, because at the same time, she was going to go through such a path for the sake of her dragon. He looked at the prince with a smile, for it seemed to him that the young lady was more reliable than he had supposed. He understood that of course the prince had no reason to burden himself with the queen's handmaiden. He understood that even if he incurred his wrath for helping her escape, it was still his duty as a loyal vassal. A moment later, the duke said with a smile that he understood the prince. The prince looked at his friend intently and said that the moment of their return must coincide with him, because it is not known when the dragon will die, so they must set out tomorrow and return on the weekend. The duke looked at the prince closely and asked if he really planned to torture the mages while they were on their way to the city. The prince sighed heavily and said that everything was exactly so, because it took him a lot of time to learn about black magic. The prince knew very well that the young lady valued her life very much, and for this reason he was sure that she would change her mind when she saw the consequences of the disaster. He knew it would be like this. Just like when she first signed the contract that was slipped to her, she knew she would lose her life when she left the tower. He knew that after such an incident, she became a completely different person, but her changed image reminded him of someone. In turn, the prince was a little puzzled, since unfortunately, he did not remember where he had seen him. Some time later, the nanny came to visit the prince. He looked at her intently and called her. She looked at him with tears in her eyes and said that it was too much of a pry on his part, since he had sent her away yesterday. She said that it looked like his fever had not gone down yet, and the towel was damp. Greta reached out to the prince, but he pushed her away. He looked at her with cold fury and said that it seemed she had not even thought that she had made a mistake. Madame was taken aback and said that everything was wrong. She looked at the prince intently and said, puzzled, that she had not thought at all that he was so attached to this child. She said that in future, she would correct her manner of communicating with the young lady. He looked at her intently and asked if that was all. Madame looked at him in bewilderment, as she did not understand what he was talking about. He looked at her with cold fury and said that he was angry because she supposedly knew everything about him. He looked at Madame intently and said that she would not have spoken like that if she had guessed how he saw the king. Greta was taken aback for a moment and stood frozen in shock. She trembled with fear and could not utter a word. Albert looked at her with cold fury and told her that she shouldn't be so arrogant. He said that she shouldn't think that she knew everything, just because she looked after him as a child. He sighed heavily and said that in any case, now all the people would know this truth. The madam looked at the prince in surprise and asked what he was talking about. A moment later, she told the prince with a grin that this background must be kept hidden, because it was akin to a curse, and if God found out, he would be angry. Albert looked at Madame intently and said that if no one believed him, he would have to personally tell her about everything and about the rumors that he had spread. The poor prince, who had received repeated death threats from his family, eventually wanted to die. And then the king appeared and lured the unfortunate, almost mad, lonely prince into his palace. Fearing that the youth would take his place, the king spread a false rumor and locked him in a tower. And the prince, having once again believed in himself, sharpened the blade of vengeance on the man who betrayed him. The lady froze in shock and looked at the prince, trembling. Albert looked at her intently and said that instead of the desired feeling of affection, the king had cultivated hatred in him. Greta trembled and begged the prince for mercy. The prince looked at her intently and said with a smile that this was a very important part, so she should listen quietly. They said that now the prince was going to overthrow the degrading king and take his place. He looked at his nanny and asked with a grin if this story was suitable for the perfect ear. He smiled and said that the right mix of truth and fiction makes her perfect. The prince looked at his nanny with a grin and said that for this reason she should not be mistaken, since she was not at all special. Madame was taken aback and said that she had not thought of such a thing at all. He looked at her intently and said that she should show this with actions and again adhere to the boundaries that she had crossed. She looked at him in surprise, but a moment later she nevertheless agreed. The prince stared after her with a grin on his face. The baron was quietly resting in the room when suddenly the duke entered. The duke looked at the young man intently and said that they had been given new orders. The baron, in turn, beamed with happiness. The duke said that he would tell about everything later, but, in short, the mission was to hide the dragon in the marquis's mansion. In turn, the baron ran around the duke and asked various questions. The baron sighed heavily and said with a grin that this was very good, because he thought that he would be crushed under the weight of the baronial and knightly titles. He knew that he did not have the strength to pretend to be noble, and besides, he had no talent. The duke sighed heavily and told the baron that he spoke of it as if he had been working all the time, but still neglected his original mission. Schubert was furious and shouted at the duke that he had been working hard then. The duke smiled and told the young man that this was exactly how it was, and that he had been working even before he took over the management of the duchy. Schubert sighed heavily and said that, of course, the duke had also helped him a lot. A few years ago, a young man was very happy because he finally received a task from his idol, and he had to become the adopted son of the baron, who was the marquise's confidant. And then, once he inherited the title of baron, kill the couple and stage an accident, everything went smoothly. But there was one problem. The young man was puzzled and did not understand why the baron had so many responsibilities, because he thought that when he received the title, he would be able to see him again. Unlike what he had expected since childhood, all he could do was watch from afar. He could not meet his idol. The young man was surprised, because his idol turned out to be an even more perfect person than he imagined, and he, in turn, was very pleased even with the fact that he could look at him from afar. The young man said angrily that up until the moment when the king locked the prince in the tower, he had been quite content with everything. The duke looked at the young man closely and said that he should not be so emotional. Schubert sighed heavily and told the Duke that he had no idea how hard it was for him to tolerate the Bergens, probably because they were connected with the Marquise, and they were simply out of their minds. He looked at the Duke intently and asked if he could change his image, as this image of the silent Baron was very tiring for him. The Duke looked at him intently and said that before he knew it, he would start talking like some kind of hooligan, so it was inevitable. The Duke looked at the young man intently and said that he had something else he wanted to tell him. The Duke looked at him closely and said that the cat he had been playing with lately. He smiled and said that it was a cute cat that the maid had brought. The Duke said that it was a baby dragon. The young man froze in place from the dude. Schubert was shocked because he was petting and touching it. He was shocked because he couldn't stand reptiles at all. At the same time, the young lady lay quietly in bed. She sighed heavily because she knew very well that Albert cared about her, and she thought that his smile was rare, but she understood that he was completely right. Rose, in turn, understood perfectly well that all the words the prince had said were true, but she wondered how she could just let her dragon go. She understood perfectly well that she would never let him just go.